21:47. A bullet punched through a SEAL operator's helmet, and he dropped like his spine had been cut. 3 seconds later, another man down. Then another. Then another. 10 enemy snipers. Total darkness, thermal optics that could read body heat through stone and shadow. And every American in that valley was already inside a prepared kill zone, moving exactly where the enemy wanted them to move. Air support, 40 minutes out. Reinforcements, an hour. Time before total wipeout, maybe 10. Then a voice broke through the static. Calm, female. Certain, cross. This is Overwatch. I can hunt them. Stay down. Nobody on that team knew her name, and the shooting hadn't stopped. If you've never seen a story like this one, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The valley had no good name on any military map, just a grid reference, a contour line, and the kind of terrain notation that made experienced men quiet when they read it. Kharan Valley. Elevation 10,400 meters. Steep ridgelines on 3 sides. A single vehicle track running north to south through the floor, bordered by loose shale, dry creek beds, and rock formations that had been providing sniper cover since before anyone in the American military was born. Chief Warrant Officer Ethan Cross had read the terrain assessment twice on the helicopter in. He'd said nothing. He had that specific quality that made good soldiers nervous and bad soldiers overconfident. He didn't reassure people, and he didn't threaten them. He just looked at things and processed, and you could tell by the set of his jaw that what he was processing wasn't good. The mission was supposed to be a precision strike package. Get in, locate the weapons cache the agency had flagged 3 weeks running, extract the target for interrogation, extract the team. 4 hours of work, maximum. They'd done it 11 times in the last 8 months, and the most exciting thing that had happened in those 11 missions was a broken ankle on a fast rope descent. 12 was different. They were 400 meters into the valley floor when the first shot came. Cross heard it before he understood it, a single crack from somewhere high on the eastern ridge, close enough to feel like a slap. Petty Officer First Class Danny Rourke, a walking 0.6 meters to Cross's left, made to sound Cross had never heard from a living person, and went down face first into the shale. The round had entered through the back of his helmet at an angle, and the helmet had done what helmets do against close-joint impacts, which is not quite enough. Rourke was moving. That was something. But he wasn't getting up. Cross had his hand on Rourke's vest drag handle before the echo had finished bouncing off the western ridge. He pulled. Rourke came with him. They got behind a rock formation the size of a compact car, and Cross got his radio up. Contact Eastern Ridge. 1 shooter minimum. Rourke's down. Possible TBI. Possible penetration. The response from command was immediate and useless. Copy. Confirm position. I'm confirming we're getting shot at, Cross said. Stand by. He was already scanning the ridgeline. Nothing. The optics on his helmet standard issue NODs, second generation, gave him green-tinted shapes and shadow, and absolutely zero useful information about what was 400 meters above him, and reading his heat signature through a scope that cost more than a year of his salary. The second shot came from the west. Senior Chief Marcus Webb was 15 meters behind Cross and moving for the same rock formation when the round caught him through the thigh. Webb was a big man, ex-college football, the kind of big that made you think armor meant something. He went down like a marionette with cut strings and started crawling immediately because Marcus Webb had been shot before and his body already had the muscle memory for it, which said something about the kind of career Marcus Webb had lived. 2 down, Cross said into the radio, keeping his voice flat. West Ridge now also. We have at least 2 shooters. Possibly more. Possibly more was the understatement of the year. The next 4 minutes were the worst Cross had experienced since a compound breach in Helmand Province 6 years ago, And that one had involved an IED and 3 of his people losing fingers. This was methodical in a way that the Helmand ambush hadn't been. Helmand was chaos, adrenaline, the kind of firefight where everybody on both sides was moving and screaming, and half of what happened was luck. This was surgical. Shot pause, reposition, shot again. Like someone up on that ridgeline was working through a list. 3 more operators went down in those 4 minutes. Psyched. None fatal Cross would confirm that later, sitting in a trauma bay at Bagram, staring at a wall and counting backward from 10 until his hands stopped shaking. But none of them were functional. Rodriguez had a round through his shoulder that had shattered the socket. Kim had taken frag from a near miss that opened his forearm to the bone. Petty Officer Hendricks, who was 23 years old and had been in country for 6 weeks, had a round through his calf that had clipped the fibula and dropped him behind a boulder, where he lay pressing both hands against the wound and making quiet, concentrated sounds through clenched teeth. 8 men had walked into Kharan Valley. 3 were capable of fighting back. Cross Gunnery Sergeant Pete Okafor and Petty Officer 2nd Class Luis Serrano were pressed behind separate rock formations 20 meters apart, and none of them had eyes on a single target. The enemy was using the elevation advantage, the darkness and thermal optics, to identify every American position while remaining essentially invisible. They weren't rushing. They weren't suppressing fire to push an assault. They were hunting, and they were patient about it. Serrano Cross said over the team frec, "You getting anything on thermals?" Negative. Serrano's voice was controlled, professional, but Cross had served with him for 3 years and could hear the thing underneath the control. Fear, properly managed, but definitely present. They're too high and too still. Nothing's registering. Okafor. I got shapes on the East Ridge. Could be rock. Could be people. Could be both. Okafor paused. A shot rang out, closer this time, and Cross heard it punch into the rock 3 feet above his head. I'm not exposing to get a better look. Smart? Cross ran the numbers. 10 snipers, that was the agency estimate, and the pattern of fire was starting to confirm it. At least 2 primary firing positions per ridge, with spotter redundancy. They'd been pre-positioned. The kill zone had been prepared specifically for this team, which meant either the mission had been compromised at the planning stage or someone had been tracking the team's movement pattern across multiple operations and had made a very educated guess. Either option was bad enough to think about later, if there was a later. Air support was 37 minutes out. Cross had already confirmed it. The nearest QRF Quick Reaction Force was sitting at FOB Terran Kaut, which was 52 minutes by helicopter in the best conditions, and it was 2,200 hours in the mountains of Pakistan's western frontier, which were not best conditions by any definition. He had wounded men who needed to move and couldn't. He had shooters he couldn't locate. He had no cover worth the name and no fire superiority whatsoever. Cross had been in the teams for 11 years. He had run operations in 7 countries. He had been in situations where the math didn't add up and had found ways to make the math work anyway, through aggression or deception or sheer refusal to accept the calculation. But this was the first time in 11 years that he genuinely could not see a path forward that didn't end with body bags. Then his radio crackled. Not command. Not QRF. A different channel, the inter-element frequency he used for attached personnel. The Army specialist who'd been assigned to their package 3 days ago, the one none of his Seasons had particularly wanted, the one they'd been polite about and dismissive of in the specific way that Tier 1 operators were polite and dismissive toward people they considered outside their ecosystem. Cross. The voice was female, quiet, and entirely calm in the way that certain people got calm when the situation went past a point where panic was useful. This is Overwatch. I can hunt them. Stay down. Cross stared at the radio for half a second. Overwatch, identify. Staff Sergeant Maya Vance. I'm on the southern approach, 300 meters from your position, currently on the ridge spur at grid 774. I've been watching the eastern positions for the last 4 minutes. I have 2 confirmed locations. Cross pressed his back against the rock. Another shot cracked through the valley, from the north this time, a position they hadn't identified yet, which brought the confirmed enemy count to at least 6 and meant the situation was even worse than he'd thought. Vance. I have 8 men down or disabled. I have air support 35 minutes out. I need these shooters located and neutralized, and I need that to happen before one of them gets lucky on my wounded. Understood. What are you carrying? There was a brief pause. Not hesitation, something that sounded more like she was deciding how much information was actually relevant to the question. MK13 Mod 7, suppressed. Enhanced optics. I'll explain the rest later. Cross had worked with snipers his entire career. He knew the MK13 bolt action, 0.3 Win Mag, effective past 1,000 meters in the right hands. He did not know what enhanced optics meant in this context, and the specific way she'd said I'll explain the rest later suggested that the rest was not nothing. Vance, he said. How long? As long as it takes. I'm already moving. What Cross did not know what none of his SEALs knew, what even most of the men who'd put her name on the attached personnel list for this operation didn't know in full, was what Maya Vance had been doing for the 3 days before the mission went hot. She had been watching. The thing about Kharan Valley was that it was exactly the kind of terrain that rewarded patience over aggression, information over firepower. Most special operations doctrine treated it as the opposite: get in, establish violence of action, overwhelm before the enemy can react. It was good doctrine for a lot of situations. It was exactly wrong for this one, and Maya had known that the moment she'd seen the satellite imagery. She'd dispatched psychologically. She'd been attached to Cross's element because someone at the Joint Special Operations Command had flagged her work on counter-sniper doctrine and matched it to the mission profile. It was a personnel decision made 3 levels above the operators involved, which meant Cross and his team had received her name on a manifest and had formed their opinions before she'd set foot on the helicopter. She'd been fine with that. She'd been dealing with those opinions her entire career. What she'd done in those 3 days was move, not with the team away from the team, along a parallel route that most experienced mountain men would have considered inadvisable and most infantrymen would have considered impossible. She'd covered high ground on the southern spur, established 3 separate observation positions, and watched the valley through optics that most people in the American military had never seen outside of a classified briefing. The scope on her MK13 was a prototype from a DARPA-adjacent program she'd helped test 18 months ago in Arizona. It operated in dual-band thermal and near-infrared, with electromagnetic emission detection layered in a passive sensor system that could identify the faint, specific heat signatures of electronic devices within a certain range. Laser rangefinders, radio transmitters, the power cells inside thermal scopes. Enemy snipers used thermal optics to find their targets. The optics ran on batteries. Batteries produced heat. The scope found the heat. It was not a perfect system. It required patience and a steady hand and an understanding of ambient temperature, wind, atmospheric pressure, and the specific electromagnetic noise floor of the terrain you were working in. Maya had spent 3 days building that understanding. She'd mapped the valley's thermal baseline the way a musician maps a new instrument, slowly, carefully, learning its specific voice. By the time Cross's team walked into the kill zone, she had 7 of the 10 enemy positions already plotted. She moved along the southern ridge spur now, 300 meters from the valley floor, staying low and slow in the manner of someone who had learned through genuine experience that speed got people killed and patience got them home. The temperature at 2,400 meters in late November was 11 degrees Celsius and dropping, and the cold was useful. It made ambient thermal noise lower, which made the warm electronic signatures of enemy optics stand out more cleanly. The first shooter was 340 meters away, northeast quadrant, inside a prepared scrape that had probably taken 2 days to build. You could tell, by the way, the thermal signature was framed rock in front, rock behind, and the shooter's body heat trapped in a pocket that had been designed specifically to reduce the chance of detection from the valley floor. It was good work. It would have been excellent work against any conventional counter-sniper approach. Maya was not a conventional counter-sniper approach. She settled into her position prone, suppressor resting on the folded edge of her pack, scope dialed to 4x to build the full picture before she narrowed down. She watched the shooter for 45 seconds, breathing pattern, head movement, scope angle, the micro adjustments that indicated target tracking versus holding. He was tracking Cross's position. He had a shot solution developing. She didn't rush. A suppressed 0.3 Win Mag at 340 meters made us sound like a hand clap in an empty gymnasium, sharp, contained, gone in a second. The thermal signature behind the scrape went still. Maya was already moving before the sound had fully died. This was the part that most people who thought about counter-sniper work got wrong. They thought the hardest part was the shot. The shot was the easy part. The shot was physics, training, equipment, and a specific quality of stillness that Maya had cultivated since she was 19 years old, lying on a frozen range in Fort Benning and learning to breathe around her own heartbeat. The hard part was everything before and after. The observation, the positioning, the relocation. Because you fired once, and after that, they knew someone was hunting them. She moved 60 meters east, found a new depression behind a cluster of boulders, and settled again. The valley below was reacting. She could see it in the pattern of fire, which had fractured from coordinated to reactive. Cross's team was still pinned, but the precision of the incoming fire had degraded. The enemy knew something had changed. They didn't know what. She gave them 20 seconds to look for it. Then she found the second position. This one was a two-man team shooter and spotter sharing a narrow ledge on the eastern ridge at approximately 290 meters. The spotter's equipment was running hot. The battery pack on his spotting scope producing a thermal signature that glowed against the cold rock like a match in a dark room. She watched the angle of the spotter's scope, confirmed he was oriented toward the valley floor and not toward her approach, took 2 steady breaths, and squeezed. The spotter went down. The shooter moved lateral, instinctive, good training, and for 3 seconds he was behind solid rock with no exposure. Maya waited. People trained to be still under fire could maintain that stillness for a while, but not forever, and not when they didn't know where the threat was coming from. He'd need to relocate, and relocation meant movement, and movement meant exposure. She counted to 11. He broke left, fast, staying low, trying to reach a secondary position. She could see from her elevation was another prepared scrape cut into the ridge face. He was good. He was fast. He was moving the way someone moved when they drilled zigzag sequence until it was automatic. But he was moving, and moving produced heat, and heat was the only language Maya's scope needed to read. She led him by 1.5 meters, accounted for the slight crosswind at ridge level, and fired. He made it 4 more steps. Then he didn't. She was moving again immediately. Down in the valley, Cross heard the pattern change before he understood it. The incoming fire, which had been coordinated and precise, suddenly had gaps in it. A position that had been putting rounds on their location every 90 seconds went quiet. Then another. Cross was counting without deciding to count, the way you did when your survival depended on pattern recognition. His radio broke squelch. Overwatch to Alpha. 2 down, Eastern Ridge. 3 and 4 North Quadrant, grid 778 and 781. Do not move until I confirm. Cross relayed the grid references to Okafor, who was in the best position to verify. She's right, Okafor said, after a moment's silence, that Cross knew meant he'd been watching those positions and hadn't seen a damn thing. How is she getting that? I don't know. CW3. That woman is not using standard NODs. I noticed. Cross heard Serrano say something under his breath in Spanish that Cross didn't catch but understood the tone of. He shared the sentiment. Vance, he said into the radio. What's your status? Moving on 5 and 6. Keep your wounded down. Don't let anyone move. Understood. Vance, I've got it, Cross. A pause. Not impatient, something more like someone telling you to stop hovering, because hovering wasn't helping. Focus on your men. Cross focused on his men. Rourke was conscious now, which was good, and had managed to wedge himself into a stable position behind the rock, which was better. Webb was applying his own tourniquet, which told Cross that Webb's hand still worked, which was about as reassuring as anything was going to get tonight. Hendricks had stopped making noise and spent 15 seconds in specific dread before he heard Hendricks curse quietly and precisely in the manner of someone in intense pain who is nonetheless present and functional. Still alive. All of them. For now. The fire from the north quadrant picked up as the enemy adapted to losing positions. One shooter was clearly adjusting his arc to cover for the two that had gone silent, putting suppressing rounds across a wider sector. Cross pressed himself flat and felt a round hit the boulder 18 inches above his head, hard enough to send fragments of stone skipping past his cheek. One piece cut him just below the left eye, not deep, not serious, but immediate and warm, and he was bleeding before he'd registered the impact. He touched the cut with his glove, looked at the blood. 6 shooters still up there. 6 trained men with thermal optics and prepared positions, and all the time in the world to wait for one of his people to move at the wrong moment. One woman on a ridge with a rifle he'd never seen in optics that apparently defied the laws of physics. Cross had spent his career making quick, violent, irreversible decisions in bad situations, and the calculation he ran in the next 4 seconds was the fastest one he'd ever made. It was also, he would realize later, the easiest. He got back on the radio. Vance, what do you need from us? Her answer was immediate. Nothing. Stay exactly where you are and don't fire unless something is directly on top of you. Every time you shoot, you give away a position. You're not going to hit anything up there anyway. Okafor's voice came over the team channel, private to Cross. Did she just tell us not to engage? She did. And you're going with that? Cross looked at the blood on his glove. He looked at Rourke, who was staring at the sky with the specific blankness of a man whose brain was running diagnostic checks it hadn't been designed to run. He looked at the valley walls rising around them in the NOD green darkness, those ridgelines that had been offering firing platforms to armed men for centuries, and thought about the math. She's taken 4 of them, Cross said. In 20 minutes. In the dark. While moving. He paused. What are we going to do that she can't? Okafor was quiet for a moment. Fair point, he said. The 5th enemy position was the hardest. Maya knew it before she reached the ridge spur that gave her angle on it. She'd plotted this position during her 3 days of observation and had marked it in her notebook with a small asterisk, her private notation for complications. The shooter was inside a cave opening, a natural formation in the eastern ridge face with only a rifle barrel and the front element of his scope extending beyond the rock. His body heat was completely enclosed. No thermal signature from his mass. Only the scope, a small, specific point source of warmth from the electronics package running inside it. At 690 meters, Cross's air support was coming. She had perhaps 20 minutes before the sound of rotors changed the entire dynamic of the engagement, which would push the remaining shooters into a decision, exfiltrate or hold. She needed them held in position for one reason. Only a moving target in broken mountain terrain at night was nearly possible to track, and she couldn't afford to trade certainty now for probability later. She needed to work fast without working sloppy, which was the precise tension that got counter-snipers killed. Fast was exposure. Sloppy was miss. She needed a third thing that didn't have a clean name, the specific quality of compressed patience, where you moved with urgency but arrived in stillness. She settled on a flat section of ridge, behind a natural parapet of shale, prone, adjusting her position by fractions until her left hip bone was on flat rock and not the edge of a smaller stone that would build into discomfort over a prolonged hold. Small things. The kind of thing people left out when they described marksmanship and then wondered why their performance degraded over long strings of fire. 690 meters. Elevation change, positive 40. Wind at this altitude, she'd been tracking it for 3 days, ran from the northwest at 4 to 6 knots with gusts to 9. At this range, a 9-knot gust moved a 0.3 Win Mag projectile approximately 14 inches laterally at impact. She needed to either time the shot for a calm window or adjust her hold accordingly. She watched the wind. The valley grass in the dry creek bed below rippled in patterns she'd been reading for 72 hours. The dust on the ridge above the cave mouth. The way the cold was pulling air down the eastern face in a consistent pattern she'd mapped on day 2. She had a 3-second window between gusts that repeated approximately every 40 seconds. Maya waited for the second repetition to confirm the pattern hadn't changed in the last hour. It hadn't. She exhaled. The third window opened. She fired. At 690 meters, the round traveled just under 3/4 of a second. In that time, the cave mouth continued to show the same small thermal point of the scope. Then it didn't. Maya watched through the scope for a full 8 seconds, confirming what she was seeing. 5, she said quietly, to no one in particular. She was already calculating the remaining positions when she heard a transmission on the enemy's radio frequency. She'd been monitoring it passively for 3 days, and the habit of listening was so ingrained, she processed it a beat before she consciously registered what she was hearing. It was brief, encoded, but it was a transmission, and transmissions on that frequency at this moment meant one thing: someone was confirming kills, reporting losses, or requesting instructions. All 3 options told her the same thing. The electromagnetic signature of the transmission had come from a position she hadn't yet plotted, north-central ridge, higher than she had expected, which explained why she'd missed it during her initial observation days. They'd had a roving element, a communication relay, staying off her map. She marked the position. 6 was about to become easier. The transmitter had gone silent, but electronics that had been running for hours left a residual signature, and the man holding the radio was doing what people did when they'd just received bad news about 4 of their colleagues he was moving. Not relocating. Moving in the agitated, uncontrolled way of a man whose confidence in his own position had just collapsed. She tracked him for 30 seconds. He crossed a gap between 2 rock formations. She fired. Somewhere below in the valley, Pete Okafor was watching the ridge through his ISNO-Ds and seeing absolutely nothing, which was starting to feel like its own specific kind of information. 6, Maya said on the radio. Moving on 7 and 8. They're starting to react. Cross came back immediately. Define react. They know I'm here. They don't know where. She paused, scanning. 7 just exposed to relocate. He's going for the secondary position on the north spur. He won't make it. He didn't. 7, she said. The valley was changing. She could feel it even before she could see it, the specific shift in the quality of a firefight when momentum crosses over. When the hunters start to understand they've become the hunted, and the psychological weight of that understanding begins to affect their behavior. But trained men held longer than untrained men. Good snipers held longer than good infantrymen. But no amount of training fully overrode the ancient animal part of the human brain that recognized a predator it couldn't see and began making decisions accordingly. The enemy was making decisions accordingly. She found 8 in a secondary position east of where she'd mapped his primary. He'd relocated well, better than 7 had, better than 6. He'd chosen a position behind a granite outcropping that blocked thermal detection from below and from the west, which was where a conventional countersnipper would be working from. It was smart. It accounted for everything except the specific elevated approach Maya was using, which wasn't in any manual he'd have trained from. She took her time with 8. The shot was angled, partially obscured by intervening terrain, requiring a precise hold that would put the round through a specific gap in the rock at a specific angle. She worked the geometry in her head, confirmed it against her rangefinder, and waited for the shooter to settle into a new position. He settled. She fired. 8, she said. Down in the valley. Cross heard it and did the math without being asked. Vance, that's 8. 2 left. I know. Remaining positions? Her voice was quieter now, not strained focused in the way of someone who had reached the specific part of a problem where all the easy solutions had been used and what remained required something else. They've shut down. Both of them. No optics running, no radio, minimal movement. They understand the situation. Cross heard what she didn't say. Understood the situation meant they understood they were being hunted by someone who could find them even when they tried to disappear. It meant they were good enough to take protective measures. It meant the next part was different from the first 8. How long, he asked. As long as it takes. Cross looked at his watch. Air support was 18 minutes out. His wounded needed medical attention, and every minute they spent pinned in this valley was a minute closer to someone's condition deteriorating past the point where field intervention could help. He didn't say any of that to Vance. He said, "Copy," standing by, and then he pressed himself against the rock and waited, and the valley went completely still. It stayed still for 12 minutes. Not the tactical stillness of the early engagement, where movement had been deliberate and disciplined. This was a different kind of still, the held breath of 2 professional hunters who understood that the first one to move was going to die and were conducting the specific mathematical negotiation of who was going to break first. Cross counted the seconds. He was aware of Rourke's breathing beside him, of Webb's occasional shifting movement as the tourniquet bit into his thigh, of Hendrick's silence, which Cross had stopped finding alarming and had begun finding reassuring, because it meant Hendricks was doing the thing that good operators learn to do in bad situations: conserve, focus, endure. He counted to 700 in. Before 1, he heard the sound. A single clink of rock against rock, somewhere on the western ridge, barely audible above the wind. The next sound was the suppressed shot half a second later. 9, Maya said. 12 more seconds of silence. 10, she said. Overwatch to Alpha. All targets eliminated. You're clear. Cross lifted his head above the boulder for the first time in 22 minutes. Scanned the ridgelines. Saw nothing moving. Heard nothing but wind and the distant mechanical rhythm of approaching rotors. He pressed the transmit button. Vance. Status. Inbound on your position. 2 minutes. Cross looked at Okafor, who had emerged from behind his own position and was standing in the valley floor with his rifle lowered and an expression on his face that Cross had never seen on Pete Okafor before. It was the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. All of that, Okafor said slowly. 10 shooters. In the dark. In 20-something minutes. 24, Cross said. He'd kept the time. Okafor stared at the ridgeline for a long moment. Who the hell is she? He said. Cross looked at the blood drying on his glove. Looked at the approaches to the valley. Looked at the eastern ridge, where 7 of the enemy's 10 positions had been, positions his experienced eyes had completely failed to locate in real time. I don't know, he said. He heard footsteps on the shale behind him. Quiet, deliberate steps, the gait of someone who moved in terrain like this, the way other people moved in hallways. He turned. Staff Sergeant Maya Vance was 31 years old, lean in the specific way of people who operated at altitude and ate whatever was available rather than what was preferred. She was carrying a rifle that Cross didn't recognize at first glance and wearing a ghillie wrap across her upper body that had been pieced together from local vegetation so precisely that when she'd been lying, still on that ridge, she'd been effectively invisible. Her face was flat, expression professionally neutral, eyes already moving across the valley floor, assessing his wounded, reading the positions of his operators, cataloging the aftermath with the systematic attention of someone who'd done this enough times to have a process for it. She stopped in front of Cross. She looked at the blood on his face. She looked at Rourke. She looked at Webb. Medevac is on the same bird as your air support, she said. Rodriguez's shoulder is the priority. How's Izzy? Cross blinked. How do you know about Rodriguez? I've been watching your team for 3 days, she said, as if this were a completely normal thing to say. I know who your strongest operators are and who your injured men are. Rodriguez took a full rotation impact through the socket joint. If there's bone fragment near the subclavian, he needs a surgeon in the next 2 hours. She said it with the same flat certainty she'd used on the radio. And Cross had this disorienting experience of being simultaneously the ranking officer and the least informed person in the conversation. He's stable, Cross said. For now, good. She looked at the ridgeline. You're going to want to police those positions before morning. Enemy command will try to retrieve the equipment, especially the scopes. The optics they were using are not standard procurement. Someone supplied them specifically for this operation. She paused. Which means someone knew you were coming. The rotors were getting louder. Cross could see the Pavehawk's lights now, low on the northern approach, moving fast. He looked at Maya Vance and tried to figure out what question to ask first, because there were approximately 12 of them queuing up behind his eyes. She met his look with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that he had questions, and she'd expected that and was prepared to have that conversation when the wounded were evacuated and the situation was secured and there was time to have it properly. One question, Cross said. Okay, the scope. What is it actually doing? Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she glanced at the rifle slung across her chest. Finding things that don't want to be found, she said. The Pavehawk came in hard and loud, rotor wash, flattening the dry grass in the creek bed, and the moment broke medics off the ramp and moving, Cross shouting positions to the crew chief, the controlled chaos of casualty extraction washing over the valley floor. Maya stepped to the side, out of the way, watching the ridgelines. Still watching. Even now, with all 10 shooters down, she was watching. Okafor appeared beside Cross as they guided the medics toward Rourke. She didn't even check to see if any of them were threats, Okafor said quietly. Not once. She looked at the ridgelines the second she walked in. I know. That's not training, Okafor said. That's something else. Cross knew he was right. He'd been around trained people his entire career, the finest shooters, the best tacticians, the most experienced operators the United States military could produce. He'd never been around someone who treated awareness the way other people treated breathing, like it was involuntary, like it was simply what she did every moment without effort. Okafor, Cross said. Yeah, get on command and pull her full file. Everything. Clearances, operations history, program affiliations, whatever she's been attached to. Okafor looked at him sideways. You think she'll clear that? I think, Cross said, watching Maya Vance watch the darkness, that whatever file they give us is going to have more redactions than text. The last medic cleared the ramp with Rodriguez. The Pavehawk lifted, banking north, taking his wounded away from Kharan Valley. Maya turned from the ridgeline. She looked at Cross. We need to move, she said. They'll have a QRF of their own. Command structure lost contact with 10 positions in 20 minutes. Someone is going to respond to that, and they won't send another sniper cell. What will they send? Something larger. She was already adjusting the sling on her rifle. I'd rather not be here when they arrive. Cross nodded to Okafor and Serrano. They moved, and Maya Vance walked point into the darkness, back toward the southern spur, moving through terrain that Cross's enhanced night vision could barely parse while she navigated it from memory. From 3 days of patient observation, from the specific knowledge of someone who had spent years learning to read the night like it was a language she'd grown up speaking. Cross fell in behind her. He had questions, a lot of them. But moving was more important than questions, and she was already 15 meters ahead, and the valley had given up all of its bodies and all of its secrets except the most important one. What exactly had the United States Army sent into Kharan Valley? And why hadn't anyone told him? The answer to that question was going to change everything he thought he knew about the operation he'd been running. It was going to change something else, too. But Cross didn't know that yet. He was still watching her move through the dark, fluid, and quiet and utterly at home in terrain that had just killed one of his men, wondering how a person got that way, what you had to have seen, what you had to have done, what had to have been done to you before the answer to all three questions arrived at the back of his mind, like a cold stone dropping into still water. She hadn't been sent here for the mission. She'd been sent here for him. The thought hit Cross at the exact wrong moment, mid-stride, descending a loose shale slope in the dark, with Cyrano 12 meters to his left, and Okafor covering their 6, and it hit him with the specific clarity of something that had been true the whole time. And he'd simply been too busy staying alive to see it. She hadn't been sent here for the mission. She'd been sent here for him. He filed it. Not dismissed filed, the way you filed incoming information during an operation when acting on it immediately would get someone killed. You put it in a compartment and you kept moving, and you came back to it when the situation allowed for thought rather than reaction. Cross was good at that. 11 years had made him very good at that. What he wasn't good at was watching someone navigate mountain terrain in the dark, with the casual fluency of a person walking a familiar street, which was what Maya Vance was doing 15 meters ahead of him, and not asking questions. He kept his mouth shut until they reached the southern spur, and found the hide she'd established a low depression between two granite formations, carefully cleared of loose rock, with a firing mat already rolled up against the left wall, and a small pack with a 2-day water supply and a sealed case he didn't recognize. She'd been operating up here. Not just observing, operating, with full field kit alone for 3 days. You slept up here? Cyrano said, looking at the depression. Enough. She was breaking down her pack, redistributing weight, making the specific adjustments of someone who'd done this hundreds of times and had a system for it. 4 hours in 2-hour blocks. There's a secondary position, 40 meters west, that is better concealment. I use that for sleep. Cyrano looked at the pack, at the empty ration wrappers folded into a small trash bag clipped to the side, at the field notebook lying open with its page of plotted coordinates in handwriting, so small and precise, it looked typeset. 4 hours, he said. You can function on less, Maya said. You just can't function well. There's a difference. She said it without condescension, matter of fact. The way you stated something that was simply true and didn't require decoration. Cyrano looked at Cross. Cross looked at the notebook. May I? He asked. She glanced at the notebook, then at him. A brief hesitation, not professionally. A brief hesitation, not reluctance, more like the internal assessment of what was appropriate to share at this stage of a professional relationship that had just been established under unusual circumstances. The coordinates are already outdated, she said. The positions are eliminated. I'm not interested in the coordinates. He picked up the notebook carefully and turned it toward the NOD light. The pages were dense with notation, not just grid references, but atmospheric data. Wind readings timed to specific hours. Temperature changes at different elevations. Patterns of movement he could see sketched in small, economical diagrams that showed the timing and frequency of enemy position activity across 3 days of observation. She'd built a model, not just a map, a behavioral model. She'd tracked these men long enough to know their routines, their patterns, their tendencies under stress. She'd known before the team even walked into the valley, how they were going to react when they started taking losses. Cross set the notebook down. "How long have you been doing counter-sniper work?" he asked. "Long enough." "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have clearance to give you." She shouldered her pack and looked at him with an expression that wasn't hostile and wasn't apologetic. It was the expression of a person navigating a system of information restrictions they hadn't designed and didn't particularly enjoy, but were going to comply with anyway. "You can request my full operational history through your J2. I do it tonight, before anyone decides what you should and shouldn't see." Cross held that for a second. The implication was specific. There were people who would edit what he received, and speed was the counter to that, which meant she knew his chain of command, or knew enough about how these information transfers worked to anticipate the interference. "You've done this before," he said. "This specific thing. Being attached to an element, and I've been attached to several elements," she said. "And?" She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her eyes, not evasion, not calculation. Something older than either of those things. "Some of those attachments went well," she said. Some of them went the way tonight started." She moved off toward the secondary route down the spur, and Cross followed, and the conversation closed itself in the specific way that conversations closed when the person speaking decided they'd given you enough for now. The debrief at FOB Coast started at 340 and lasted 3 hours. Cross sat across a folding table from Major Dennis Hartwell, the JSOC liaison, who ran mission assessments for the regional package, and gave a chronological account of the engagement that was as precise and complete as any debrief Cross had ever delivered. He was good at debriefs. He was good at stripping out the emotional content and rendering events as sequences of observable facts, which was what after-action reporting required and what most operators took years to learn. Hartwell listened without interrupting. He took notes in the particular way of a man who had already been told what happened and was verifying that the person in front of him was going to tell the same story. When Cross finished, Hartwell looked at his notes for a moment. "Staff Sergeant Vance," Hartwell said. "She eliminated 10 enemy positions in 24 minutes, Cross said. "In total darkness, on unfamiliar terrain, using optics I've never seen deployed in a field setting. She's attached to your element through a technical assessment program," Hartwell said, which was the kind of sentence that answered nothing and was designed to answer nothing. "Her role was advisory. Her role was what actually happened," Cross said. "I had 8 men down. The air asset was 37 minutes out. Without her intervention, I would have lost people." "You lost Corpsman Reyes," Hartwell said, and the words landed with the weight they deserved. Cross was quiet for a moment. He'd gotten the confirmation during the flight back. Corpsman Second Class Anton Reyes, 28 years old, Sacramento, California, married 11 months ago, had been hit in the first exchange of fire. The round had caught him in the neck above his plate carrier at a specific angle that the trauma surgeon at Bagram had described as extraordinarily unlikely and extraordinarily lethal. He died before the Pavehawk touched down. "Yes," Cross said. "Vance was deployed with your element for 3 days prior to the operation," Hartwell said. "Bet. Are you telling me she was watching the valley during that period and didn't report the enemy pre-positioning to your team?" Cross felt the question land and recognized its architecture. It was designed to produce a specific answer, or at least to put him in the position of either defending Maya Vance or not defending her, both of which were positions that could be used later in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. "She reported her findings through her own chain," Cross said carefully. "I can tell you what she told me and what she did. I can't tell you what her reporting protocol was for the advisory program she was attached through." Hartwell made a note. "The equipment she was using," Hartwell said. "Describe it." "MK13, Mod 7. Suppressed. The optics system was a dual-band thermal with what she described as EM detection capability. Passive sensor." Cross paused. I've never seen it in a field deployment. I'd seen something in a capability briefing maybe 18 months ago. The DARPA program. Hartwell's pen stopped moving. You have exposure to that program? Capability briefing only. I wasn't read into the program. Cross leaned forward slightly. Hartwell, what is she? Hartwell put his pen down. He was a career Army officer, 53, the kind of man who'd survived long enough to have a very specific sense of what information he could part with and what information required authorization he didn't have. The look on his face right now was the look of the second category. She's an Army Staff Sergeant attached to your element through a technical evaluation program, Hartwell said. That's the information I have. That's the information you have clearance to share. Hartwell looked at him. I'd like to interview Sergeant Vance, Cross said. She's been debriefed separately. I know. I'd like to interview her myself. That's, Hartwell paused. That's not standard procedure for attached advisory personnel. No, Cross said. It's not. He stood up. She told me to request her full operational history tonight, before anyone decided what I should and shouldn't see. She said that specifically. Hartwell's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. I'll put the request through, Cross said. Tonight. He walked out of the debrief room and down the prefab corridor to the FOB's secure communications section, where he sat in front of a terminal and sent a formal complete operational history of Staff Sergeant Maya Vance under his authority as the ranking officer of the engagement element. He marked it priority. Then he went to find her. She was in the equipment cleaning room, a separate prefab building at the east end of the FOB, fluorescent lit, smelling of solvent and gun oil, sitting on a metal stool with her MK-13 broken down across a field cleaning mat, working through the barrel with a bronze bore brush in the methodical, unhurried of someone who cleaned their weapon the way they did everything else, correctly, completely, without shortcuts. She didn't look up when he came in. Debrief go okay? She asked. Hartwell's a careful man. Hartwell's a man who knows more than he's authorized to say and has made peace with that. She ran the bore brush through the barrel again, checked it, seemed satisfied, set it aside. How's your face? Cross touched the cut below his eye. He'd had it cleaned and taped at the medical station, not deep enough to need stitches, which the PA had seemed almost disappointed about. Fine. You need to be more careful about fragment exposure. I was being shot at. People are always being shot at, she said, with a specific flatness that implied this was not an excuse. The ones who stay useful find ways to protect their eyes and their hearing, regardless. She picked up the bolt and began working a cotton patch along its face. Fragment below the eye at that angle, another 2 centimeters, and you're dealing with a corneal injury. In the field, that ends an engagement. Cross pulled a second stool from the wall and sat down, because this was clearly going to be a conversation that required him to match her pace rather than his own. You've had fragment eye injuries, he said. She glanced at him. I've been around people who had them, she said. The outcome is instructive. He watched her work for a moment. Her hands were completely steady, not the steadiness of conscious control, but the natural steadiness of a neuromuscular system that had spent years training out the tremor that most people carried in their hands without knowing it. Sniper hands. He'd seen it before. He'd never seen it so pronounced outside a competition setting. Hartwell said you were debriefed separately, Cross said. I was. He said you're attached through a technical evaluation program. That's accurate. It's not complete. She looked up from the bolt. This time she held his gaze, and Cross got the impression she was running the same assessment she'd been running since the Valley reading him, taking inventory, deciding where the line was. What do you want to know? She said. Everything. That's not how it works. I had a man die tonight, Cross said. He kept his voice level, but he let the weight of it sit in the room without apology. Reyes, 28 years old. He went down in the first exchange of fire, which means he was one of the first men hit in a kill zone that was prepared specifically for my team. Which means someone knew we were coming, and the mission was compromised at the planning stage. He paused. You told me the scopes they were using weren't standard procurement. You told me someone supplied them specifically for this operation. You'd been watching the valley for 3 days, and you knew those positions existed. Did you know the mission was compromised before we walked in? The question sat between them. Maya set the bolt down on the cleaning mat. She didn't look away from him. I had an assessment, she said. Not a confirmation. An assessment based on the quality of the enemy positioning and the specific equipment they were using, the kind of preparation that doesn't happen accidentally and doesn't happen without good intelligence on. The target element's movement pattern and timing. An assessment, you reported. Through my chain. To who? She was quiet for a moment. That's the part I can't tell you, she said. Can't or won't. Both. She picked the bolt back up. Cross. I understand what you're asking, and I understand why you're asking it, and if our positions were reversed, I'd be asking the same things. But there's a compartment here that I can't open for you, and trying to open it without authorization is going to cause more problems than it solves. She paused. What I can tell you is that when I submitted my assessment, I was told the operation had been evaluated and was proceeding. I was not told why, and you went along with it. I went into the valley 3 days early to make sure that if it went wrong, someone would be in position to do something about it. She said it without drama, without any apparent expectation that it should be impressive. It was the statement of a decision she'd made and had been prepared to live with, which is what happened. Cross sat with that for a while. He was a man who'd made hard calculations under pressure his entire career, and he recognized the architecture of the one she'd described, the specific kind of decision where you couldn't stop a bad thing from happening, but you could position yourself to limit the damage. He'd made variations of it himself. He'd never made it from the position she'd been in, which was a position that required her to absorb the weight of knowing and not being able to say so, and so still showing up anyway. Reyes, he said. I know, she said quietly. I'm sorry. It wasn't performative. It was the specific contained quality of someone who carried their dead in a private place and didn't put them on display, but also didn't pretend they weren't there. The woman everyone had underestimated had changed how American forces fought after dark. Cross almost smiled, not because anything was funny, but because the thought arrived with an irony that was too precise to ignore. He'd underestimated her. He'd read her personnel summary, seen the rank, seen the Army designation on a SEAL element manifest, and formed a judgment in about 15 seconds that had been completely wrong. The scope, he said. Walk me through what it actually does. She considered this, seemed to decide it was within acceptable parameters, and set down the cleaning patch. Standard thermal optics read body heat, she said. It's the basic principle, everything. With temperature above absolute zero emits infrared radiation, and the warmer an object is relative to its background, the more distinctly it registers. A human body in cold mountain terrain is a clear thermal signature. You already know this, right? The problem with using thermal against a prepared enemy is that they know you're using it, and they can design their positions to manage their heat signature. Insulation, rock barriers, depth. A good scrape, properly constructed, can reduce a shooter's thermal signature to almost nothing from ground level. She paused. The system I'm using adds 2 things. First, passive near-infrared, which picks up ambient heat differential at longer ranges than standard thermal, and at different frequencies, it's readings a slightly different part of the heat spectrum, which means positions that have been optimized against one thermal signature can still register on the other. Second, and this is the part that isn't in any public catalog, passive EM detection. The batteries, Cross said. She looked at him. A slight shift in her expression, not surprise exactly, but the acknowledgement that he'd gotten there faster than expected. The batteries, she confirmed. Any electronic device running in the field, thermal scopes, laser rangers, radio equipment, produces electromagnetic emissions as a byproduct of power consumption. The emissions are specific to the device type and the power state. The system has a library of emission signatures. It cross-references what it's detecting against the library and identifies probable device types and locations. She picked up the cleaning patch again. In practice, what it means is that I can find a sniper who has perfectly concealed his body heat if he's running a thermal scope, because the scope tells me where he is. How far? Distance degrades the detection quality. Reliable identification out to about 800 meters. Past that, you're getting data, but the confidence interval on location drops off. She ran the patch along the bolt face. The system is still in evaluation. There are failure modes I haven't fully mapped yet. What kind of failure modes? Multi-source interference, heavy EMF environments, certain atmospheric conditions that create noise in the near IR band. She paused. And the obvious one, a shooter who's running purely passive. No electronics, cold scope, manual correction, no radio. Against that, the system gives you nothing you couldn't get with standard NODs. The last two, Cross said, the ones who shut down. Yes, you found them anyway. One of them shifted position after 12 minutes. Couldn't hold the stillness stress response, probably. The thermal body signature came through a gap in his cover. A brief pause. The other one, she stopped, ran the patch again. The other one held. I found him because he breathed. Cross looked at her. Specifically, she said, because the temperature differential between exhaled breath and ambient air at 2,400 meters is significant enough that if you're watching the right location and you're patient enough, you can detect it. She set the patch down. He'd concealed his body, his equipment, and his movement. He couldn't conceal biology. Cross was quiet for a long moment. How long did you train for this? He asked. I didn't train for it, she said. I was already doing the observation work. The equipment was built around what I was already doing. Someone built optics around one person's methodology. The program decided it was worth formalizing. What program? She looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite not a smile. The one that doesn't appear on any manifest I'm authorized to discuss, she said. Cross stood up. He was tired in the specific way of a man who'd run a full operation, absorbed a casualty, done an hour-long debrief, and was now discovering that the situation was significantly more complex than the situation he thought he was in. I've submitted a J2 request for your full operational history, he said. I know. She began reassembling the Mk-13, and she did it the way she did everything, with a fluid, sequential precision that made it look easy and wasn't. You'll get a version of it. Probably not the version you want. Will the version I get tell me what you actually are? She seated the bolt, ran the action, checked the function. Then she looked at him over the top of the rifle, with an expression that had something in it he hadn't seen from her before. Not quite tiredness, not quite sadness. Something more specific than either, like a woman who'd been asked a question she'd thought about the answer to for a long time and still wasn't sure she had it right. I'm a staff sergeant in the United States Army, she said. That part is accurate. And the rest? She set the rifle down. The rest is what happens when someone is very good at something that most people don't believe is possible until they've seen it done. She stood up, broke down the cleaning mat, folded it in the specific compact way of someone working within limited pack space. Get some sleep, Cross. Your team needs you functional in the morning. She walked to the door. Vance. She stopped. Didn't turn. Reyes had a wife, Cross said. 11 months married. A moment. I know, she said. He kept her photo in his kit. Left breast pocket, behind the medical card. Cross stared at the back of her head. She had red hair, Maya said, in the photo. Then she walked out. Cross stood alone in the equipment room with the smell of gun oil and the fluorescent hum and the specific weight of the night's events settling into him the way the weight always settled. Eventually, not all at once, but incrementally, each thing finding its place in the ledger that every operator carried. The mission, the dead, the things that had happened, and the things that almost had, and the distance between those two categories that was sometimes a decision and sometimes just luck, and was never, in Cross's experience, something you could reliably distinguish between in the immediate aftermath. He thought about what Maya Vance had said, about the assessment she'd submitted, about being told the operation had been evaluated and was proceeding. He thought about the scopes, non-standard procurement, specific to the operation. He thought about Anton Reyes and a red-haired woman in a photograph behind medical card and the 7-snet window between them twin on to the valley and taking the first round that had determined everything else. He left the equipment room and walked back to the secure communications section and checked his J2 request. Response pending. That was fast for a routine personnel query. Too fast. He sat down at the terminal and looked at the status indicator and thought about what Maya had said before anyone decides what you should and shouldn't see. He pulled up the request log. His query had triggered an automated notification flag standard procedure for certain categories of personnel, the kind who were attached to programs with sensitive information controls. He'd seen the flag before, on 2 or 3 occasions involving personnel he'd never gotten full records on. He looked at the flag category. He'd seen the category designation twice in his career. Both times, the personnel in question had turned out to be involved in programs that operated in spaces that didn't appear on standard JSOC organizational charts. He sat back. Pete Okafor appeared in the doorway behind him. "You need to see something," Okafor said. His voice had a quality. Cross recognized the careful, contained quality of a man who'd found information and was choosing his words around it. "What?" "The enemy positions." Okafor came in and sat down at the adjacent terminal. "I sent a collection team up the East Ridge 2 hours ago. They found all 7 positions she'd identified. Verified them, photographed them, took equipment. And the scopes cross." Okafor turned the terminal toward him. 2 of them had identifying marks still on the hardware. Partial serial numbers. Our collection team ran them. Cross looked at the terminal screen. "Those serial numbers belong to a procurement batch," Okafor said slowly. "That was logged as lost in transit on a supply manifest from Kandahar Airfield 14 months ago." Cross looked at him. "Lost in transit," he said. "That's what the manifest says." Okafor's jaw was tight. "Which means either the enemy intercepted a supply convoy and no one flagged it for 14 months, or they didn't come from a convoy," Cross said. Okafor nodded. Once. The nod of a man who'd arrived at a conclusion he didn't want to be right about. Someone put those scopes in that valley," Cross said. "Specifically, for this operation. Which means someone knew about this operation far enough in advance to source the equipment, pre-position 10 shooters, and establish a kill zone." Okafor was watching him. Cross. Who knew the full operational detail on this package? Cross counted them. The number was small, deliberately small, by design, because the operation had been a precision package with a limited intelligence footprint. He counted them, and he didn't like the number. And he especially didn't like the implication of what it meant when you mapped that number against the equipment provenance that Okafor had just put in front of him. "Get this to the collection team report," he said. "All of it. Flag it for CI, counterintelligence." The word sat in the room with a specific gravity. "Already did," Okafor said. "About 20 minutes ago, and someone from Hartwell's section called me back in 12 minutes. Okafor paused. "They told me the C referral was being handled at the theater level, and I should refrain from further independent inquiry into the equipment provenance." Cross looked at him. "They told you to stop looking," Cross said. "They told me it was being handled. At the theater level." "Yes." Cross turned back to the terminal. He looked at the J2 request for Maya Vance's file still pending, flag still active, now with a secondary notation he hadn't seen before. A routing addendum. His request had been automatically forwarded to a secondary review office whose designation he didn't immediately recognize. He recognized it on the second look. He'd seen that designation once before, 18 months ago, in a capability briefing that had covered emerging technical programs in special operations. It was not a JSOC designation. It was not an Army designation. It was the kind of designation that appeared on documents that moved through channels most people in the American military didn't know existed. He looked at the routing addendum for a long time. Then he closed the terminal, stood up, and looked at Okafor. Where is Vance right now? Billeting B block. She's sleeping? Lights are on. Cross looked at the door, looked back at the terminal, looked at Okafor, who was watching him with the expression of a man waiting to be told what the next move was, and not entirely sure he wanted to know. She told me to get her file tonight, Cross said, before anyone decided what I should see. And I think someone has already decided. Cross moved toward the door. I need to talk to her again. Before the morning brief. Cross. Okafor's voice stopped him. Whatever she's wrapped up in, whatever that flag designation means, you sure you want to pull that thread? Cross thought about Reyes, about the red-haired woman in the photograph, about a supply manifest from Kandahar with a 14-month-old notation about lost equipment and 10 snipers who'd been in that valley long enough to build scrapes into the rock and who'd been carrying optics that someone had very deliberately put into their hands. Someone compromised our operation, Cross said. One of my men is dead. Okafor was quiet. So yes, Cross said, I'm pulling the thread. He walked out into the FOB's pre-dawn darkness across the gravel apron between prefab buildings, and he was thinking about what Maya Vance had said in the equipment room, about the program that didn't appear on any manifest, about the assessment she'd submitted, about being told the operation was proceeding without being told why, about spending 3 days on a ridge alone because she'd done the math and had understood that if she was going to be there, she needed to be there early. He was halfway to B block when he saw her. She was outside, standing at the east edge of the gravel apron, looking at the mountains. Not in a contemplative way, she wasn't standing with her hands in her pockets, staring at something beautiful. She was standing the way she stood everywhere, weight balanced, scanning. Even here, inside a faux B with a perimeter and guards, she was watching the terrain. He walked up beside her and stood there for a moment, looking at the same mountains. The J2 request, he said. Routed somewhere you didn't expect, she said. It wasn't a question. You knew that would happen. I suspected it. A pause. The flag on my file triggers a secondary review. It's supposed to protect program integrity. What it actually does is create a window where people who want to manage the information can get ahead of the request. The routing designation, Cross said. I recognized it. She looked at him then. Actually, he turned and looked at him. From where? She asked. A capability briefing. 18 months ago. He met her eyes. The technical evaluation program that built the optics. She was quiet. That's the same program, Cross said. Isn't it? She turned back to the mountains. I can't confirm or deny the organizational affiliation of the program I'm attached to, she said. That's the confirmation, Cross said. Another silence. The kind that had weight. The equipment provenance on those scopes, Cross said. My team found serial numbers. Kandahar manifest. 14 months. He saw something move through her expression. Not surprised she'd expected this eventually. What moved through her expression was something that looked, for just a moment, like the specific relief of having waited a long time to be in a room with someone who was finally asking the right questions. I know about the manifest, she said. You knew before tonight. Yes, that was part of your assessment. Yes. And when you submitted that assessment and were told the operation was proceeding, I understood that the people telling me to proceed were either confident they had the situation contained, she said, or they were part of the reason the situation existed. She paused. I didn't know which. I still don't know which. And not knowing is the specific problem I've been carrying for the last 11 weeks. 11 weeks. Not 3 days. 11 weeks. Cross looked at her profile against the dark mountain range and understood, with the specific cold clarity of a man doing arithmetic he'd been avoiding, that Maya Vance had not been sent to Kharan Valley for this operation. She'd been working toward Kharan Valley for nearly 3 months. And the question of who had sent her the actual organizational structure behind the routing designation on his J2 request was connected to the question of who had put those scopes in the valley, which meant Maya Vance was not just a counter sniper specialist attached to his element. She was an investigation, and he just walked into the middle of it. She was an investigation. Cross stood next to her in the pre-dawn cold and let that land the way it needed to land, not rushed, not deflected, just taken in and understood. 11 weeks of work building toward a single valley in the mountains of western Pakistan, and a kill zone that somebody had built specifically for his team, and optics that had been logged as lost 14 months ago, and had ended up in the hands of 10 men who'd known exactly where to wait. Maya was still watching the mountains. How much of what happened tonight was anticipated? Cross said. The engagement scenario, she said. The timing was approximate. I thought you had 2 more days before they moved. They moved early. Someone pushed the timeline. Cross felt the cold in a new way. Who? That's what I've been trying to establish for 11 weeks. She paused. Someone in your planning chain has been feeding operational detail to a network that sources equipment through gray market military procurement channels and subcontracts violence to regional actors. They're not ideological. They're commercial. Commercial. They get paid to make operations fail. She said it without decoration. Specifically JSOC operations in this theater. Specifically operations that are connected to a set of cache locations that someone, somewhere, has an economic interest in protecting. Cross thought about the mission brief. The weapons cache the agency had flagged. The target for extraction. The cache we were going after tonight, he said, is the 4th in a series. The previous 3 operations that attempted to access those thoughts on locations had equipment failures, route compromises, or engagement contacts that aborted the mission. She turned to look at him. None of those operations lost personnel. Tonight was different. Tonight they escalated. Why tonight? She was quiet for a moment. Because I was here, she said. Cross looked at her. Someone in the network knows about the program I'm attached to, she said. Not the full picture, they don't have the technical specifics. But they know there's an enhanced counter-sniper capability being evaluated in theater, and they know it's been attached to your element, and they decided that the appropriate response was to bring enough firepower to make sure it didn't matter. She paused. 10 sniper souls instead of the 4 they used on the previous operations. The upgraded optics, the prepared kill zone. That's not a routine escalation. That's a response to specific intelligence about a specific threat. About you, Cross said. About what they thought I could do. A slight pause. They underestimated it. Cross processed the sequence. Someone in his planning chain. Someone who knew about the element composition, the mission objective, the attached personnel. Someone who'd known Maya was coming and had decided 10 trained snipers with purpose-sourced optics was the appropriate counter. The J2 request, he said. My file request on you triggered a flag that routed to your program office. Yes, which means your program office knows the request exists. They knew within about 4 minutes of you submitting it. And whoever in your chain is connected to the network that compromised my operation may also know, she said. Yes. Cross looked at the mountains, looked at the FOB perimeter, looked at the prefab buildings arranged in their utilitarian grid, and thought about how an FOB looked when you stopped seeing it as a secure base and started seeing it as a location where a limited number of people had access to a limited set of information, and how that changed the geometry of the problem. You need to tell me who you report to, he said. I report to a program director whose identity I'm not authorized to share. Within the theater? Within the theater. So they're here. Or proximate. She didn't answer, which was an answer. Vance, Cross said. If your program director is in this theater, and someone in this theater is connected to the network. I'm aware of the implication, she said quietly. I've been aware of it for 6 weeks. He stared at her. 6 weeks of working inside a structure where someone with potential access to her reporting chain was connected to the people who'd just tried to kill his team, and she'd been carrying that alone, moving forward with the operation. Because stopping would have destroyed the 11 weeks of positioning she'd built. That's why you went to the valley 3 days early, he said. Not just to observe. If you stayed in the faux B, your movements and findings were reportable. In the field, my reporting was my own, until I came back in, she said. 3 days of independent observation time, operating under field protocols where I could work the problem without anything I found being visible to the people I was finding it on. That's why you couldn't tell us about the kill zone, Cross said. If you'd reported it through the element, it would have gone up the chain, and whoever compromised the operation would have known you'd identified the positions. They would have moved or reinforced. Either way, the intelligence value was gone. She looked at him steadily. I made a calculation. I know what the calculation cost. Reyes, the red-haired woman in the photograph. Cross held that for a long time. He wasn't the kind of man who made it simple, who reduced a complicated decision to a clean verdict of right or wrong and assigned blame accordingly. He'd made calculations with costs. He knew what they felt like from the inside and how they looked from the outside, and that those two things were rarely the same. What do you need? He said. She blinked. It was a small thing barely perceptible, but it was the first moment since he'd met her that she'd reacted to something he'd said with something other than expectation. From you specifically? She said. From me specifically. She was quiet for a moment, and he got the impression she was recalibrating. She'd anticipation, justification demands, possibly an attempt to extract her from the operation entirely. She hadn't anticipated the question he'd actually asked. Access to the equipment provenance. Report your team compiled, she said. The serial's number trace. Before it goes up the chain. Done. And I need 12 hours before you escalate the CI referral. Cross looked at her. You want to move on something. I want to verify something, she said. There's a difference. A pause. 12 hours. If I can't confirm what I think I know in 12 hours, you can take everything to Theater CI, and I'll cooperate fully. He studied her face. The flat professionalism was still there, it was always there. But underneath it, right now, at 430 in the pre-dawn cold, was something more specific. The look of a person who had been building toward a moment for 11 weeks and could see it close enough to touch. What do you think you know? He said. She held his gaze. I think I know which name is on the other end of the procurement channel, she said. And I think that name is going to be familiar to you. Cross didn't ask the name. Not yet. If she'd wanted to give it to him, she would have. Instead, he said, 12 hours. But I'm not standing down. I'm not asking you to stand down. I'm going to be in the room, he said. Whatever you're verifying, I'm there. She considered this. The consideration was genuine. He could see her working the angles, assessing what his presence added and what it complicated. Operational risk, she said. If this goes wrong, you're exposed. One of my men is dead, Cross said. I'm already exposed. Another silence. Longer this time. All right, she said. They had until 1,600 hours before the mandatory theater-level mission review, which Hartwell had confirmed via message to Cross at 500. Mandatory meant non-negotiable, and a theater-level review meant personnel from the regional command structure, which meant a full reporting chain activation that would make it impossible to manage information flow. 12 hours. Less now. Cross got Okafor and Serrano into a room the small briefing space in B Block, which had no communications terminals and no recording equipment, and which Cross had verified by walking the perimeter himself and told them what he knew. Not everything. Enough. Okafor listened with his arms crossed and his jaw doing the thing it did when he was processing anger and not expressing it. Serrano listened with his eyes on the table, which was how Serrano processed information that he found genuinely alarming. When Cross finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. Someone in the planning chain, Okafor said finally. That's the assessment. And Vance has been working this for 11 weeks. Yes. Okafor looked at Maya, who was standing near the wall with her arms loose at her sides, not leaning, not posturing. Just present and still and letting the information do what it was going to do. You couldn't have told us, Okafor said to her. Not a question. Working through it? No. If you'd told us, we'd have reported it. Yes. And Reyes might still be alive if the operation had been aborted. He said it without softening it. He was that kind of man. He named the hard thing because not naming it didn't make it smaller. Possible, Maya said. Or the operation abort would have been flagged as intelligence sourced, and the network would have moved its people, and we'd have lost the 11 weeks of positioning. And the next operation against those cache locations would have hit the same kill zone with a less informed team. She paused. I made a judgment call. I've made them before. Some of them were right. I carry the ones that weren't. Okafor was quiet for a long moment. I don't like it, he said. I know. But I understand it. He uncrossed his arms. So what's the play? The play was built around a single piece of information that Maya had been holding for 6 days, a communication intercept from the passive monitoring she'd been running from the southern ridge, using a signals collection component of her equipment package that she hadn't mentioned to Cross until now, because it hadn't mentioned his relevant until now. The intercept was 47 seconds of encrypted voice traffic on a frequency that, according to the emission signature library in her optics system, matched a communication pattern she'd been tracking for 9 weeks. The voice traffic was encoded, but the frequency profile, timing, and specific emission fingerprint pointed to a communications relay she'd identified as part of the procurement network's regional coordination structure. The relay was physically located in Coast City, not at the FOB, but in the city itself, which was 22 kilometers southeast, accessible by road in 40 minutes. A relay means a physical device, Cross said. A physical device means a location, Maya confirmed. And a location means records, traffic logs, contact lists, routing data. She opened the sealed case he'd noticed in her hide, the one he hadn't recognized. Inside was an equipment configuration he'd never seen in the field, a compact signals analysis unit with a directional antenna array that folded flat for transport. If I can get within range of the relay, I can pull its traffic log passively. No intrusion, no footprint. The device broadcasts to maintain network contact. I'm just listening to what it's already broadcasting. Without a warrant, Serrano said. This isn't a law enforcement action, Maya said. Within a partner nation's urban area, Serrano said, 22 kilometers from an American FOB, using collection equipment that isn't in any standard operational authorization I've ever seen. He looked at Cross. I'm noting this for the record. Noted, Cross said. Are you in or not? Serrano looked at the ceiling for a moment. I'm in, he said. I'm just noting it. They left the FOB at 640 in a standard utility vehicle, the kind that moved between the base and Coast City, often enough to be unremarkable. Cross drove. Okafor was in the passenger seat. Maya and Serrano were in the back, with the signals unit between them in a civilian carry bag. The road between the FOB and Coast City was flat in some sections and rough in others, and required a specific kind of attention that Cross found useful because it gave him something physical to do while his mind ran the problem. He'd been running it since the pre-dawn conversation, checking it from different angles, looking for the seam where his understanding had a gap. The gap was the name. Maya had said the name on the procurement channel would be familiar to him. She hadn't said it. He hadn't pushed. But he'd been turning it over since then, mapping it against the planning chain for the Kharan Valley operation, and the list of people with full operational detail was short enough that the process of elimination was almost complete. He was fairly sure he knew. He wasn't going to say it until he had confirmation, because the specific name in his head was a name that came with consequences that went well beyond this operation, and naming it wrong was a different kind of catastrophe than naming it right. The city came up gradually, the edge of it, bleeding from open terrain into compound walls and market structures, and the specific layered density of a place that had been inhabited for a very long time. Cross-navigated by the route they'd briefed back at the Faux B, following the pattern of roads that Okafor had pulled from commercial mapping and cross-referenced against the signals. A mission location Maya had plotted. They stopped 3 blocks from the target location, a commercial building in the district of commercial buildings, unremarkable, the kind of structure that looked different from every other structure, only if you knew what you were looking for. Maya got the signals unit out of the bag and assembled the antenna array in the back seat, working in the careful economy of practiced motion. She connected it to the processing unit, ran a 30-second calibration, and looked at the display. "I'm picking up the emission," she said. 68 meters, bearing 225. The building on the corner. "Second floor," Okafor said, looking at the structure. The angled window facing southeast. Best line of sight for a relay antenna, pointed toward the mountains. "Yes." "How long for the log pull?" "Passive collection needs 8 to 12 minutes of continuous exposure at this range." "You're pulling a traffic log from 68 meters away," Serrano said, "through the walls of a building." "The relay is broadcasting through the walls of the building," Maya said. "I'm just receiving what it's sending." She settled into position. The unit held steady against the seat back. Antenna pointed at the corner building. 12 minutes. "Cross. I need the vehicle stationary." "It's stationary." "Good." The 12 minutes were among the most uncomfortable Cross had spent in a vehicle that wasn't actively being shot at. The street was moving around them. Foot traffic. A cart. 2 motorcycles with the ordinary indifference of a city that had been occupied and fought over and left to itself and occupied again, and had developed the specific resilience of places that had absorbed too much history to be shocked by any single piece of it. At 9 minutes, a man came out of the corner building. Cross saw him before anyone else, reacted. 30s, local civilian dress, moving with the specific pattern break of someone who'd been inside and was checking the outside, eyes doing a quick arc of the street that wasn't the same as a casual look. That was the look of a man who monitored his environment deliberately. "We have eyes on the vehicle," Okafor said quietly. "He can't know what we're doing," Cross said. "He doesn't need to know. He just needs to decide we're worth a second look." The man's eyes passed over their vehicle, lingered, moved on. He went back inside. 2 minutes, Maya said. "He made us," Serrano said. "He noticed us," Cross said. "Different thing. Keep still." The 2 minutes were longer than the previous 10. Cross watched the building entrance, watched the upstairs window, watched the foot traffic for the specific disruption that would indicate someone moving fast with purpose toward their position. Nothing moved that way. "Complete," Maya said. "I have the log." "Go," Cross said, and started the engine. They were a kilometer from the target building, moving on a northern route back toward the FOB road, when Maya said, "I need 20 minutes to process this." "You have 20 minutes," Cross said. She worked in silence in the back seat. Serrano watched the road behind them. Okafor watched the road ahead. Cross drove and did not ask questions because questions weren't going to make the processing faster, and the answer was either going to be what Maya thought it was going to be, or it wasn't, and both outcomes required him to be steady. At 17 minutes, she said, "Cross." Something in the way she said it, one word, his name, with a quality he hadn't heard from her before. Not alarm, heavier than alarm, the specific weight of confirmation. "Tell me," he said. The relay traffic log has 41 days of routing data. Her voice was flat, but with something underneath it. The contact identifier for the primary coordination node, the person or entity authorizing the network's operations in this theater, uses a communication pattern I can cross-reference against known terminal identifiers in the operational network. And a pause. The terminal identifier matches a classified communication account assigned to the JSOC theater advisory structure, she said. Specifically to the position of Senior Intelligence Liaison, Regional Special Operations Command. Okafor turned in the passenger seat. Cross kept his eyes on the road. Senior Intelligence Liaison, Regional Special Operations Command. One person held that position, and that person had been in his planning chain for the Kharan Valley operation, and that person's name had been the name sitting in the back of Cross's mind since 430, when Maya had told him the name would be familiar. He said it anyway, because it needed to be said out loud by someone who wasn't Maya, so that it existed in the room as a fact that more than one person had confirmed. Hartwell, he said. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Dennis Hartwell, Maya said. Yes. Okafor said nothing. He turned back to face the road and put his hands on his knees and was absolutely still. And Cross knew that it was the stillness of a man containing a reaction that needed containing. Because the situation required function over feeling. He ran your debrief, Serrano said from the back seat. He ran my debrief, Cross confirmed. He would have seen your J2 request come in and would have known you were pulling Vance's file. Yes. And when Okafor's CI referral came in on the equipment provenance. He called Okafor, back inside 12 minutes, Cross said, and told him to stop looking. The vehicle was quiet for a long moment. Its outsides, the terrain was opening up from the city's edge, back toward the flat road north. The mountains beginning again in the distance. This is not enough, Cross said. A traffic log cross-reference to a terminal identifier. That's intelligence. It's not evidence. Not the kind that ends a career or starts a prosecution. I know, Maya said. What else do you have? Enough to get the right people to look in the right places, she said. The log gives us routing patterns, timing, communication volume. It gives us a structure we can present to counterintelligence with enough specificity that they can build a technical case independent of what I pulled. She paused. What I pulled tonight is the roadmap, not the destination. Who do we take this to? Not Theater CI, she said immediately. Theater CI is in Hartwell's advisory chain. If we take this to Theater CI, it's on his desks by tomorrow morning. NCIS, Okafor said, possible, slow. She was looking at the data on her processing unit. There's a mechanism through my program office, a direct reporting channel to a DoD oversight component that sits outside the theater structure. It was built specifically for situations where the in-theater chain may be compromised. Your program director? Cross said. No, above the program director. She looked up. The oversight component has the authority to freeze information flow within a theater structure, pending investigation. If I submit through that channel with this data, Hartwell's access to the planning and reporting systems gets suspended within 6 hours without him being notified why. And then he can't sanitize anything, can't move anything, can't communicate through the network channels we've identified. She paused. And then the technical case that counterintelligence builds from the log data finds things that are still where they were left. Cross turned the vehicle north and drove and ran the math one more time because the math needed checking. If you submit through that channel, he said, your program office knows. Your program director knows. Yes. And you said you weren't sure whether your program director was connected to the network. Silence. I said I wasn't sure 6 weeks ago, she said. I'm more sure now. How much more sure? The log has 41 days of routing data. The program director's terminal identifier is not in it. A pause. That's not exculpatory. He could be using a separate channel I haven't identified. But the primary coordination network, the one that managed the Kharan Valley operation, doesn't route through anything connected to my program director's access profile. That's not confirmation, Okafor said. No, Maya said. It's the best I have. Cross pulled the vehicle off the road onto a flat section of ground between the road and a dry irrigation channel and stopped. He left the engine running. He turned in his seat and looked at Maya directly. She looked back at him. If you're wrong about your program director, he said, and you submit through that channel, this entire investigation surfaces to someone who's part of the network. Hartwell gets warned, the evidence gets moved, and we have nothing. Yes, and you're asking me to trust your assessment on the program director's reliability based on an absence of data in a log that you pulled from 68 meters away through a building wall using equipment that's in technical evaluation. Yes, she said again. No apology, no softening, just the word, flat and precise it, with the weight of someone who'd made her calculation and was standing behind it. Cross looked at her for a long time. He thought about Hartwell's face during the debrief. The careful neutrality, the specific quality of the questions designed to probe without revealing, to document without committing. He'd been in that room, and he'd read Hartwell as a cautious bureaucrat navigating a complicated after-action. And he'd been wrong, and being wrong had not felt like anything in particular because he'd had no reason to be right. He thought about Reyes and what it meant that Reyes was dead because someone had escalated the violence specifically, because Maya was attached to this element, specifically because someone had decided that enhanced counter-sniper capability in the field represented a threat to their commercial arrangement and had authorized the use of 10 men with purpose-sourced optics to eliminate that threat before it could eliminate the arrangement. He thought about 11 weeks. He thought about 3 days on a ridge. He thought about the specific quality of trust, not the kind that came from knowing someone for years, but the kind that came from watching someone make a decision under pressure and recognizing the architecture of how they made it. Submit through the channel, he said. Maya held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then she looked at the processing unit and began composing the submission. It took her 4 minutes. She was precise about it, structuring the log data with analytical annotations that gave the oversight component enough context to immediately understand what they were looking at. Attaching the equipment provenance report that Okafor had pulled from the collection team, cross-referencing the timing of the Kharan Valley operation escalation against the network's communication volume spike that the log showed beginning 48 hours before the engagement. When she submitted it, she set the processing unit down on the seat and was still for a moment. Done, she said. What's the expected response time? Cross asked. The protocol says 6 hours for a freeze request. Realistically, if the oversight component recognizes what this is, faster. Cross started the engine. Then we go back to the FOB, he said, and we act like we've done nothing, and we wait. Nobody in the vehicle said anything for a while. The road back to the FOB was the same road they'd come out on. Same terrain, same morning light getting harder as the sun pushed above the eastern mountains. Cross drove. At some point, Okafor said, when this is over, I want to know one thing. What? Cross said. What she actually did for 11 weeks before Kharan Valley. He glanced at the back seat. The full version. Maya looked at him. That's going to require a different kind of clearance than the one you have, she said. I figured. He turned back to the road. Ask me anyway, though. After, she agreed. They were 4 kilometers from the FOB when Cross's radio activated on the element frequency, not a voice, just a data ping, the kind that came through the secured terminal access when something had been flagged for immediate attention. He recognized the flag type, theater-level urgent, originating from the Senior Intelligence Liaison's office. Hartwell. Cross looked at the flag timestamp. It had been generated 6 minutes ago, which was approximately 16 minutes after they'd collected the relay log and approximately 12 minutes after they'd confirmed the terminal identifier match. "He knows," Serrano said quietly. "He knows something," Cross said. "Not necessarily what. Enough to send a theater urgent flag." Cross looked at the flag. Then he looked at the road ahead, the FOB's perimeter becoming visible now, the guard posts, the wire. "Maya," he said. "Yes. How confident are you in the 6-hour response time?" A pause. "Less confident than I was 20 minutes ago," she said. Cross pressed the accelerator. The vehicle moved faster. Whatever Hartwell knew or suspected, the next several hours were going to determine whether 11 weeks of work resulted in something that meant something, or whether the network swallowed its own tail and disappeared and left nothing but a dead corpsman and a compromised operation, and the specific bottomless frustration of being unable to prove what you knew. Cross had been in situations where the window was closing, and the thing that kept it open was forward motion pure, committed, irreversible forward motion that moved faster than the opposition could respond to. He drove. Behind him, Maya had her phone out and was looking at it with an expression that was not quite alarm and not quite recognition. Something between those two things. Cross saw it in the rearview mirror. "What?" he said. She looked up. "The oversight component," she said. "They've already acknowledged receipt." "How fast?" 11 minutes from submission." She looked at the phone. "They're not asking for clarification. They're not asking for additional documentation." She paused. "They've already initiated a freeze request on the Theater Intelligence Liaison Office Communications access." Cross felt something. He didn't have a clean word for the specific sensation of a machine that you've set in motion and cannot now stop, doing exactly what it was built to do. "Hartwell doesn't know yet," Okafor said. "He will," Maya said. "The system notifies the affected office within 2 hours of freeze initiation, which gives us 2 hours before he knows his access is suspended. And why," Cross said. "Yes. Is that enough time?" Maya looked at her phone. Looked at the FOB getting closer. Looked at the data still cycling on the processing unit and the 41 days of routing information that was now in the hands of people who had the authority and the tools to do something that Maya Vance and Ethan Cross and 2 SEAL operators in a utility vehicle were not positioned to do alone. "It's going to have to be," she said. The FOB gate was 50 meters ahead. Cross slowed, let the guard run the vehicle check, and drove through when it cleared. He parked in the motor pool and cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the specific silence of a decision fully made and submitted and past the point of retrieval. Then his radio activated again. Not Hartwell's flag this time. A different channel, the secure direct line from the regional command element, which only activated when something had changed at a level above the normal operational structure. Cross answered it. The voice on the other end was not Hartwell's. It was a voice Cross had heard twice in his career, in settings that had been tightly controlled and very specifically convened, and hearing it now on a field radio, in a vehicle parked in the motor pool of FOB Coast, was the kind of thing that reset your understanding of how serious the situation had become. "Chief Warrant Officer Cross," the voice said. "This is Deputy Director Kharan, DoD Oversight. I need you to confirm your current location and the status of Staff Sergeant Vance." Cross looked at Maya. Maya had gone very still. "I'm at FOB Coast," Cross said. "Staff Sergeant Vance is with me." "Good," the Deputy Director said. "I need you to listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is going to change how the next 6 hours work." He listened, and it did. Deputy Director Kharan's voice on the radio was the kind of voice that had spent decades delivering information in controlled environments and had lost, somewhere along the way, the capacity for small talk or preamble. "Major Hartwell became aware of the freeze initiation approximately 9 minutes ago," Kharan said. "He attempted to access 3 separate communication terminals in the JSOC liaison section and was denied each time. He's currently in his office and has not attempted to leave the FOB. A pause brief, operational." We'd like to keep it that way for the next 4 hours, while our technical team works the log data you submitted. What I need from you is physical presence. You and Sergeant Vance need to be visible in routine activity so that Hartwell doesn't have reason to believe the freeze originated with your element. He already flagged us, Cross said. Theater urgent 40 minutes ago. I know. That flag was generated before the freeze hit his access. It was a precautionary move on his part, not a response to the freeze. He may have suspected your element was involved in something without knowing specifically what. Another pause. The flag creates an obligation for you to respond to his office. I'd like you to do that. Cross looked at Maya. Her expression was still, but her eyes were doing the rapid sequential calculation he'd come to recognize as her processing mode, running the angles, mapping the outcomes. You want us to walk into Hartwell's office, Cross said. I want you to respond to his flag, Kharan said. Routine operational coordination. You were the mission element lead. A post-engagement flag from the intel liaison is normal administrative process. If you ignore it, he'll know something is wrong. If you go in and treat it as routine, he has to perform routine too. And if he doesn't perform routine, then we learn something useful. A pause that had something in it. Cross. Hartwell is smart. He knows his access is suspended. He doesn't know why yet, and he doesn't know the specific data we have. Right now, he's sitting in a room running worst-case scenarios. What he needs to believe for the next 4 hours is that the worst case hasn't arrived yet. Cross ended the call. The vehicle was quiet. He's asking us to walk into the room with the man who tried to have us killed, Serrano said. He's asking us to make Hartwell think we don't know that, Cross said. Same thing, different thing. Cross looked at Maya. Can you do that? She considered the question with the same seriousness she applied to everything. Hartwell has never had a direct conversation with me, she said. He knows I exist from the manifest and from whatever the network told him about my program. But we've never been in the same room. She paused. You have. I sat across a table from him for 3 hours this morning. And I thought he was a careful bureaucrat, Cross said. So apparently I can do it. Something moved across Maya's face. Not quite a smile. The acknowledgement of a dark irony that was too precise to entirely ignore. Okafor, Cross said. Serrano, you two are not in this. Cross Okafor started. If Hartwell is running scenarios, he's going to be looking at who knows what. You two were on the operation. That's expected. But if the full element walks into his office an hour after his access got frozen, he'll read the pattern. Okafor didn't like it. Cross could see that in every line of the man's body. But Okafor was a professional, and professionals distinguished between what they liked and what the situation required. Check on the team, Cross said. Webb, Rourke, Rodriguez. Legitimate reason to be occupied. And if it goes wrong in there, Okafor said. Then you'll know, Cross said, because I'll stop being on the radio. Hartwell's office was in the command block, a proper prefab structure with actual interior walls, and a door that closed, which in a FOB environment was a marker of rank and roll. Cross knocked, waited, heard the specific quality of silence that preceded a person composing themselves before they responded. Come in. Hartwell was behind his desk. He'd been there a while. Cross could tell by the specific state of the coffee on the desk, which had been sitting long enough to develop the flat surface of something that had been poured and forgotten. His uniform was sharp, which meant he'd composed the external presentation carefully. His eyes were the tell, the eyes of a man who hadn't slept and was working very hard to look like a man who had. He looked at Cross. Then at Maya, who had come in behind Cross and was standing with her hands loose at her sides, the way she stood everywhere, in a posture that most people read as relaxed, and that Cross now understood was her default operational state. Hartwell looked at her for a fraction of a second, longer than he should have. Staff Sergeant Vance, he said. He said it neutrally, professionally. I haven't had the opportunity to debrief you directly. Sir Maya said. One word, respectful, unrevealing. Hartwell looked at Cross. I flagged your element for post-engagement coordination. Standard process after a casualty event. Understood, sir, Cross said. We've been handling medical follow-up on the team. Rodriguez is being transferred to Bagram for surgical consultation. Rourke's neurological assessment came back clean. Good. Hartwell wrote something on the notepad in front of him. The writing was controlled, Cross was watching his hands, and the control was deliberate. I also flagged, because of the CI referral your team submitted on the equipment provenance. Okafor's team found serial numbers on the scopes, Cross said. Standard collection protocol. The referral was submitted without my office being in the loop, Hartwell said. Post-engagement collection findings go through the intelligence liaison for theater contextualization before CI referral. Cross looked at him. I wasn't aware of that protocol, sir. It's in the standing orders for the regional package. Hartwell's voice was even. I've been managing the contextualization on those serial numbers. There's background on that procurement batch that changes the picture. The equipment was part of a tracked gray market resale operation that our network assets have been monitoring. A C-seat referral at this stage could compromise ongoing source relationships. He said it smoothly. Cross had to give him that it was a well-constructed cover, plausible enough to require verification to disprove, specific enough to sound like the kind of operational complexity that regularly appeared in theater intelligence work. If Cross hadn't been sitting on 41 days of relay log data and a freeze initiated by a DoD oversight component, he might have walked out of this room satisfied. I understand, sir, Cross said. Do you want the referral recalled? Hartwell paused. The pause was a fraction too long. I'll handle the coordination with Theater CI, he said. Your element's obligation is complete. He made another note. What about Sergeant Vance's equipment? The optics system she was using in the field. I'll need to inventory it for the technical evaluation programs after action. Cross felt the specific quality of the ask. The optics system. The thing that had found 10 snipers by reading their electronic emissions. The thing that had found a relay device in Coast City, pulled 41 days of routing data that was now in the hands of a DoD oversight component, actively working to build a case. He glanced at Maya. She was looking at Hartwell with an expression that was professionally neutral and absolutely opaque. The equipment is in my secured kit, sir, she said. I'll need to process the after-action data before inventory. Program protocol. How long? 48 hours. Standard evaluation timeline. Another pause. Cross watched Hartwell's hands on the notepad. The pen had stopped moving. I'd like to expedite that, Hartwell said. Given the casualty event and the operational complexity, a full equipment audit is appropriate. I'll need to contact my program director for authorization to expedite, Maya said. The equipment has handling restrictions that sit above my own authorization level. I'll make that contact, Hartwell said. What's your program director's name and office? Maya looked at him steadily. Lieutenant Colonel Warren Solis, she said. DoD Technical Evaluation, Program NIGHTGLASS. The contact goes through a secure channel I can provide you. Hartwell wrote the name down. Cross watched him write it and watched his face while he wrote it and saw the specific micro-expression of a man who had received information he needed and was managing the response to receiving it. Hartwell now had a name, a program name, things he could move against if he decided that moving was the right response. Cross said, "Is there anything else, sir? We have a team morning brief at 1100. Hartwell looked up from his notepad. The two men looked at each other across the desk, and Cross understood that Hartwell was running the same kind of assessment that Cross ran with people, the specific calibration of reading someone's awareness level, trying to determine how much they knew and how much they were performing not knowing. Cross kept his face in the territory of routine professionalism. Tired, post-operation, going through the administrative steps. That's all, Hartwell said. I'll be in touch about the equipment inventory. Cross nodded. He and Maya walked out. The door closed behind them, and they walked down the prefab corridor in silence through the external door, across the gravel and into the open air, and Cross kept walking until they were 20 meters from any building with anyone in it. Then he stopped. He's going to move on Solis, Maya said, before Cross could speak. Solis is your program director. Yes. The one you assessed as not connected to the network. Yes. She looked at the mountains. Hartwell is going to try to reach Solis through the program contact channel to either get ahead of whatever reporting Solis has received or to determine if Solis is already compromised from Hartwell's perspective and needs to be neutralized. Neutralized how? Information. Discrediting. In the short term, probably just an attempt to get the equipment audit fast-tracked through Solis's authority before I can complete my after-action processing. She paused, which would give Hartwell access to the relay collection data on the processing unit. Can he get it that way? If Solis authorizes an expedited audit and Hartwell's people conduct it before I've offloaded and cleared the unit, yes. She turned to look at him. I need to clear the unit, right now. Your quarters? 3 minutes. They moved. Cross stood outside Maya's quarters in B block while she worked inside for 4 minutes longer than 3, which would have bothered him more if he hadn't understood by now that her time estimates were compressed and her actual completion time was probably the minimum safe duration for whatever she was doing. She came out with the processing unit in the civilian bag. Done, he said. The log data is transmitted. The unit is cleared. She paused. When Hartwell's people audit it, they'll find a standard evaluation system with standard after-action files and nothing that references Coast City or a relay device. And the actual data is with the oversight component. She adjusted the bag, which is the only place it needs to be. Cross is radio activated. Okafor. Cross. Webb and Rourke are asking questions. What kind? The kind where they've had 3 hours and functional brains, and they've done the same math you did about who knew enough to put that kill zone together. A pause. Webb's in medical. He's got a tourniquet on his leg, and he's asking me to tell him who sold us out. Cross looked at Maya. Tell him we're working it, he said. Tell him to stay in medical. He's not going to like that. He's going to like the alternative less. Keep them contained. He clicked off. Maya was watching him. Your team, she said. My team, he confirmed. They have a right to know. They'll have a right to know what the oversight component decides to release, she said carefully. If this comes out the wrong way, if Hartwell's legal defense team gets to frame the narrative before a formal finding. I know how it works, Cross said. I've testified in 3 military investigations. I know how a defense attorney takes an operational finding and turns it into ambiguity. He paused. That's why we need the log data to hold. It'll hold, she said. The routing patterns are 41 days of data. That's not a single intercept that can be argued as coincidental. That's a behavioral record. His attorney is going to say the terminal identifier match is circumstantial. His attorney is going to say a lot of things. She looked at him steadily. That's why we also have the equipment provenance, the timing correlation, and the specific operational pattern across the 4 compromised missions. A pause. It's not one thing. It's the weight of everything together. Cross nodded slowly. The weight of everything together. That was also how he'd been trained to build a mission package. Not a single decisive element, but a convergence of confirmed intelligence that left the minimum possible room for alternative interpretation. How long before Kharan's team has an initial assessment? He said. He said 4 hours from the freeze initiation. We're 2.5 hours in, which gives Hartwell an hour and a half before his access is formally suspended, and he knows we know. If he doesn't already suspect, he suspects, Cross said. He doesn't know. There's a difference. She almost smiled at that, the faintest acknowledgement that he'd returned her own distinction back to her. Then Kharan called again. This time it wasn't routine. We have a problem, Kharan said, and the quality of his voice had shifted, still controlled, but with an undercurrent that hadn't been there before. Hartwell contacted an outside number 40 minutes ago. Not through his suspended access, through a personal device we weren't monitoring because we didn't have sufficient predicate to include it in the freeze scope. Cross felt the specific holds of a situation moving faster than the containment around it. "What number?" he said. "A number associated with a regional logistics contractor that has pending DoD contracts in this theater." The call was 4 minutes long. "We don't have content. The personal device wasn't tapped, but the timing and the contact association are significant." "He's warning them," Cross said. "That's our assessment." "What does that mean for the investigation?" "It means we're moving the timeline. We're initiating a formal hold on Hartwell's movement within the hour. We're also requesting that your FOB commander restrict movement on the vehicle pool until we can get an oversight team on the ground." A pause. "I need you to go back to Hartwell's office." Cross was quiet for a moment. "And do what?" he said. "Keep him engaged. Keep him in the room. Every minute you keep him in a conversation is a minute. He's not making another call." Kharan paused. "Take Vance with you." Taking Vance changes the dynamic significantly. "Taking Vance is the point," Kharan said. "He needs to see that she's still routine, that she's still attached to your element and conducting normal post-operation activity. If he's spooked enough to contact the contractor, he's running a threat assessment in his head. Right now, the unknown quantity in that assessment is what Vance did and didn't collect during the operation. Seeing her behave normally is the most stabilizing thing for his threat assessment." Cross looked at Maya. She'd been close enough to hear the call through the speaker. "He wants me to walk back in there," she said. "He wants us both to walk back in there." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Hartwell knows my program name now. He may have already run it. If he has contacts who can pull program-level information quickly, and a man with his access profile and his outside relationships probably does, he's going to know more about my specific role in the next 30 minutes than he knew this morning." She paused. "Which means the next time he looks at me, he's going to be looking at me differently. Can you hold that?" The question sat in the air. It was the same question he'd asked before, "Can you do that?" And it had the same weight, the same specific demand. Maya Vance looked at him, and for a moment, Cross saw something he hadn't seen from her before, not inserting exactly, but the human acknowledgement that this was harder than the ridge. The ridge had been a physical problem, a technical problem. This was performance under scrutiny from someone who was actively trying to read through the performance. This was the kind of thing that required a different category of control. "Yes," she said, "not immediately, after the moment." Knowing what yes cost. They walked back to the command block. Hartwell was standing when they came in this time. Behind his desk, jacket on, the specific posture of a man who had decided that sitting projected the wrong thing. "Chief Warrant Officer," he said. Then he looked at Maya, and Cross saw it, the fractional shift that Kharan had anticipated. He'd run NIGHTGLASS. He knew more than he'd known 20 minutes ago. His eyes moved across Maya's face with a different quality of attention. "I wanted to follow up on the equipment audit timeline," Cross said. "Sergeant Vance contacted her program director. Solis is prepared to authorize a standard and timeline 48 hours. I said I'd like to expedite that. Solis indicated the handling restrictions are program mandated. He'd need a formal request through the DoD Technical Evaluation Office." Cross paused. "I can give you that contact if you don't have it." Hartwell looked at him. "I've already reached out to that office," Hartwell said. "Then you've spoken with Solis. I've initiated contact." A pause. "The program is more extensively compartmented than I'd anticipated, based on the manifest notation. It's a technical evaluation program, sir. Compartmentation is standard. For a staff sergeant's field assignment, the equipment is the sensitive element, not the personnel rank." Cross kept his voice even. "Sergeant Vance's rank is administrative. Her operational role is consistent with the program's technical scope." Hartwell looked at Maya again, directly, the kind of look that was asking a question he couldn't ask directly. Maya met it without movement, neutral, present, the professional blankness she wore like a Saxon skin. "Sergeant Vance," Hartwell said, "the counter-sniper engagement last night. 10 targets. Walk me through the sequence. It was a test." Cross recognized it immediately, not an administrative question, a probe. Hartwell wanted to hear her describe what she'd done, wanted to calibrate the gap between her stated role and her demonstrated capability, wanted to assess how much she understood about what she'd exposed. "I provide counter-sniper support to the mission element," she said, "using enhanced optics to identify and engage enemy positions that were outside the detection capability of standard night vision equipment." 10 positions, Hartwell said, in 24 minutes. The first 7 positions had been plotted during 3 days of prior observation, she said. "The engagement was faster because I wasn't finding them cold. I was confirming pre-identified positions. And the last 3? Reactive. The enemy adapted. I adapted." She paused. "That's counter-sniper work." Hartwell studied her. Cross watched Hartwell study her and watched Maya receive the study without any visible response. "The optics system," Hartwell said, "it detects electromagnetic emissions from electronic devices." The air in the room changed. Cross kept his face neutral. Maya kept her face neutral. "The system has multiple detection modalities," she said. "Thermal, near-infrared, and a passive EM component for identifying electronic devices in the field environment." "Electronic devices like radio equipment," Hartwell said. "Among other categories. In what range?" "Classified at the program level, sir." She met his eyes. "That's a question for Lieutenant Colonel Solis." Hartwell was quiet for 4 seconds. Cross counted them. "The relay device," Hartwell said. The 2 words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Flat, hard, past the point of performance. Cross stayed still. Maya stayed still. Hartwell had just told them how much he knew, which meant the contact 40 minutes ago had given him more than a warning. It had given him specific intelligence about what the relay device was and what it could be used to collect. And he decided in this room, with both of them standing in front of him, to put the card on the table, which meant he'd run his own threat assessment, and had decided that the performance of not knowing was no longer worth the cost. They were past the pretense. "There's a relay device in Coast City," Hartwell said, "associated with a regional communication network. If your system detected it and you used it to pull traffic data," he stopped, looked at Cross. "I need to know what you submitted and to whom." "Sir," Cross said, "I don't know what you're referring to." "Cross." Hartwell's voice dropped the formality. "I've been in this work for 22 years. I know when a debrief is a debrief, and I know when it's something else. And I know that an equipment freeze on my communication access that initiates 6 hours after a field collection operation doesn't happen by accident. I can't speak to your communication access, sir." "Who did you submit to?" Hartwell said. His voice was still controlled. The control was costing him more than it had 20 minutes ago. "Theories I can manage. The log data without context is interpretable in multiple directions. But if you submitted to the oversight component," "Major Hartwell," Maya said. He looked at her. It was the first time she'd addressed him directly, and she dropped the "sir." And in that room at that moment, those 2 things landed with the specific weight of a person who has stopped navigating a hierarchy and is speaking directly. "The submission was made," she said. "The log data is with the oversight component. The equipment provenance, the timing correlations, and the 4 prior mission compromise events are part of the package." She paused. "I know you've been doing this for 22 years. So you know what the next 4 hours look like." Hartwell looked at her for a long time. Something happened in his face. Not collapse, he was too practiced for collapse, but the specific quality of a man who has been carrying a weight and has just understood with absolute clarity that the carrying is over. "You were never just a counter-sniper," he said. "No," she said. How long? 11 weeks, she said. The operation started 8 weeks before Kharan Valley. Hartwell looked at his desk, at the notepad, at the name he'd written on it, Solace, NIGHTGLASS, and then at the window, and then at nothing in particular, the unfocused look of a man reassembling his understanding of a sequence of events. Reyes, he said. The name came out differently than anything else he'd said, without the control. Reyes was yours, Cross said. The flatness in his voice was not performed. 28 years old. He had a wife. He's dead because someone escalated the violence in that valley specifically to counter an asset they knew was coming. Hartwell was quiet. You escalated it, Cross said. Or you authorized it, or you communicated enough information to the people who made the decision that the result is functionally the same. He paused. Which one? Hartwell looked at him. The silence lasted a long time. I need a lawyer, Hartwell said. Cross nodded once. That's the first thing you've said today, he said, that I believe completely. He took out his radio and contacted the FOB commander. And within 40 minutes, Major Dennis Hartwell was in an administrative hold in his own office, with 2 MPs outside the door, and Kaz and a legal representative being flown in from Bagram, and the theater-level mission review that had been scheduled for 1,600 hours had been quietly rescheduled to never. Cross sat on a concrete barrier outside the command block and looked at the mountains. Maya sat down beside him. Not close. The distance of 2 people who'd been through something together and were processing it separately in proximity. Reyes, Cross said. Yes, it's not enough, he said. Whatever happens to Hartwell, however the investigation runs, and whatever the finding is, it's not enough. No, she said. It never is. He looked at his hands. The cut below his eye had started to itch, which the PA had told him meant was healing, and he found that fact annoying in a way he couldn't entirely account for. 11 weeks, he said. Yes. And when this investigation runs, whatever comes out, you go back into the program. She didn't answer immediately. That's generally how it works, she said. To the next operation, yes. Cross looked at the mountains. He thought about the 3 days she'd spent on that ridge. He thought about what it meant to carry an assessment for 6 weeks and not be able to say it to anyone. He thought about the 4-hour window when she'd sat in the pre-dawn cold with the knowledge that the operation was compromised and had made the calculations she'd made. He thought about the weight of that, specifically, and what it did to a person over time. Does it bother you? He said. The 11 weeks. The not saying. A long pause. It bothers me the right amount, she said. If it didn't bother me at all, I'd be the wrong person for the work. He looked at her. She was watching the mountains. Her face in profile was the same professional neutral it always was, and underneath that, Cross had learned to read the thing beneath the neutral, not because she'd dropped the mask, but because he'd been paying attention. She was tired. Not the tired of one sleepless night. The tired of something longer and more accumulated, the specific exhaustion of a person who had been running very hard in a direction that required them to be alone about it. He didn't say that. He didn't know her well enough to say it and wasn't sure it was the kind of thing she wanted said. What he said was, the team is going to want to talk to you. She turned from the mountains. I know, she said. Webb especially. I know. He's going to ask you the same things I asked. Why you didn't tell us. What the calculation was. He paused. He's going to be less patient about the answers than I was. Good, she said. He looked at her. If he wasn't angry, she said, it would mean it didn't matter. It matters. She stood up from the concrete barrier, straightening in the specific way of someone whose body was carrying more physical fatigue than they were acknowledging. Take me to him. Cross stood. He looked at this woman who had spent 11 weeks building toward a night that had cost 1 man his life and saved 7 others, and had taken down something that had been operating for at least 14 months at the expense of 4. Prior operations and untold operational integrity. Who had done it alone on a ridge in the dark with equipment that shouldn't exist yet, and a methodology that nobody had thought to formalize until she'd already been doing it for years. He didn't say any of that, he said, this way. And they walked toward the medical block, and the morning was getting harder and colder, and somewhere in the mountains to the west, Kharan Valley was quiet for the first time in a long time. Webb was sitting up in the medical cot when they came through the door, leg elevated, tourniquet replaced with a proper pressure dressing, face carrying the specific gray pallor of a man who'd lost enough blood to feel it in his thinking. He looked at Cross first, then at Maya. He looked at Maya for a long time. "You're Vance," he said. "Yes." "You pulled me behind that rock formation," he said it flatly, not as gratitude, as fact. After the second shot, "I was trying to drag myself, and someone grabbed my vest and moved me. I figured it was Cross." "Cross was already behind cover with Rourke," Maya said. "So it was you." "Yes." Webb processed this. He looked at his leg, looked at the ceiling, looked back at Maya with the expression of a man who had a great deal to say and was deciding what order to say it in. "You knew," he said before we walked in. "You knew the valley was compromised." "I had a strong assessment," Maya said, "not a confirmation." "Strong enough to spend 3 days on a ridge by yourself." "Yes, but not strong enough to tell us." The medical block was quiet. Rodriguez was 2 cots over, sedated post-surgery, shoulder reconstructed by a Bagram surgical team that had flown in specifically. Rourke was absent, cleared for limited movement, last seen in the commissary, eating everything he could reach, which was the specific recovery behavior of a man whose body was demanding calories after a traumatic night and whose brain hadn't caught up yet with what had happened. Webb was the one with the functional rage, and he was the one Maya was standing in front of, and Cross stayed out of it because this was not his conversation to manage. "I need you to understand something," Maya said. "Not because it makes you feel better. Because it's true." She pulled the chair from beside the adjacent cot and sat down so she was at eye level with him, rather than standing over him. "If I had told your element that I assessed a compromise in the operational planning chain, that information would have gone up through your reporting structure. Your reporting structure ran through Hartwell. Hartwell would have been told that I'd identified the compromise, and then the valley would have been cleaned up before we got there," Webb said. 10 bodies disappeared. Equipment moved. Nothing to find. His jaw was tight. "I understand the logic. Do you accept it?" He looked at her. A long, hard look. "No," he said. "Reyes is dead." "Yes. The logic doesn't bring him back." "No," she said. "It doesn't. So what do I do with that?" The question was genuine. Not rhetorical, not aggressive, genuinely asking. A man trying to find the place to put something that had no clean place to go. Maya was quiet for a moment. "You put it where you put all of them," she said. "And you keep going." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have," she said. "I've been looking for a better one for 4 years, and I haven't found it yet." Webb looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. The specific precognition of one person carries a ledger meeting, another who carries the same kind, and understanding, without needing to say it, that the carrying doesn't get lighter, but it gets more familiar, and familiar is the closest thing to manageable that this kind of work ever produces. He let out a long breath. "Hartwell," he said. "In administrative hold," Cross said. "Legal representation on the way from Bagram. The oversight investigation is active. He's going to have good lawyers." "He's going to have excellent lawyers," Cross said. "But the log data is 41 days. The equipment provenance is documented. The 4 prior mission compromises are on record." He paused. "It's not clean. It's never clean. But it's enough." Webb looked at his leg. "Enough," he said, with the specific quality of a man for whom enough was not the same as sufficient. "Webb," Cross said. "I know." He leaned back against the pillow. "I know." He looked at Maya one more time. "Next time you're attached to an element, I'll try to find a way to tell them sooner," she said, "without destroying the investigation. You do that." "I will." He closed his eyes. They left him. The oversight team arrived at FAB Coast at 1,340 hours, 4 people in civilian clothes who moved through the base with the specific, purposeful efficiency of people who'd done this in worse locations and were grateful for the relative orderliness of a functional FOB. Deputy Director Kharan was not among them. He was managing the theater-level coordination from a location. Cross was not given. The team lead was a woman named Carver, no rank, offered, no agency identified, who shook Cross's hand with the brief firmness of someone who had a great deal to do and would prefer to start doing it. Chief Warrant Officer Cross, I've read your operational record. You made good decisions last night under very bad conditions. I made slow decisions, Cross said. Vance made the fast ones. Carver looked at Maya. Sergeant Vance, she said. We need to debrief you separately. Full operational timeline, 11 weeks. Understood, Maya said. That's going to take several hours. I know, Carver looked between them. She had the specific quality of someone who was very good at reading situations, and what she read in this one, she kept to herself. Cross, she said, we'll need you available for the evidentiary stage. Probably 48 hours from now. Until then, stand down. Your element has earned it. Cross nodded. Maya picked up her kit bag. She looked at Cross. It was one of those moments that didn't have obvious language for it. 2 people who'd been through something compressed and intense and had ended up on the other side of it. And now the thing was over, and the structure that had held them in proximity was dissolving. And what remained was the ordinary human awkwardness of goodbye, without a clean framework for what the relationship actually was. The file, Cross said. The one Kharan's team is going to compile from the investigation. Will it have your name on it? Probably not, she said. Program confidentiality. Yes. He looked at her. Then, how does anyone know what you did? She seemed to consider the question with the same seriousness she's applied to everything, and the answer she gave was the answer of someone who had thought about this long enough to arrive at a position she could actually hold. The people in that valley know, she said. You know. Webb knows. She paused. That's not nothing. It's not enough, he said. Then stopped. Heard himself say what Webb had said an hour ago, and recognized the specific irony of it. She heard it too. A slight shift in her expression, not quite a smile, something more interior than that. No, she said, but it's what there is. She extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a professional at the end of a professional engagement. And Cross held it for 1 second longer than strictly necessary, because it was the only thing he had that was an adequate response to 11 weeks of work and 24 minutes on a ridge and a name on the back of a photograph that he was going to be carrying for a long time. Then she walked with Carver toward the command block, and Cross watched her go, and Okafor appeared at his left shoulder because Okafor had a specific talent for appearing at Cross's left shoulder at moments that required it. She going back in? Okafor said. When the debrief clears. Into another operation. That's the job. Okafor was quiet for a moment. She's going to spend the rest of her career doing that, he said. Going in. Coming out. Nobody knowing what she did. Some people know. The right people? Cross thought about Reyes. About the red-haired woman who was going to get a casualty notification within the next 24 hours, delivered by 2 people in dress uniform, who would tell her everything they could, and nothing that would actually help her understand why. I don't know who the right people are anymore, Cross said. 48 days later, Major Dennis Hartwell was formally charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice with violations that included espionage-adjacent conduct, unauthorized disclosure of classified operational information, and conspiracy to obstruct a DoD investigation. His legal team was excellent, as Webb had predicted. They were not excellent enough. The log data held. The equipment provenance held. The testimony of Chief Warrant Officer Ethan Cross, filed under seal, formed the evidentiary backbone of the case that the oversight component presented to the military tribunal. Cross testified for 9 hours across 2 days, with the specific precision and completeness that 9 hours of testimony required. And when the defense attorney attempted to characterize the Kharan Valley operation as a failure of command planning rather than deliberate compromise, Cross answered each question with the same flat accuracy he brought to everything. On the third day of testimony, the defense introduced a challenge to the admissibility of the relay log data, arguing that the collection methodology was unauthorized. The equipment was in technical evaluation status, and the chain of custody was irregular at best. The challenge was denied. The log data had been collected by an operator acting within the scope of a program-authorized field evaluation in an environment where the operator had reasonable grounds to believe the collection was critical to force protection. The chain of custody had been maintained by direct submission to a DoD oversight component, whose authority sat above the theater structure. The tribunal found the challenge without merit. Hartwell was convicted. Cross was in his quarters at Faux Bragg when the verdict came through, reassigned from theater, pending the completion of a multi-element operation review that had been triggered by the Kharan Valley engagement. He read the notification on a secure terminal and sat with it for a while, not celebrating, not relieved, just sitting with the specific quality of an outcome that was correct and insufficient in equal measure. He thought about the 4 prior operations that had been compromised, about the operators from those engagements who had aborted or failed without ever understanding why, and whether any of them would ever be told the real reason. Probably not. Probably the report would sit in a compartment and they'd carry the incomplete version of events, the equipment failure, the route, compromise, the engagement contact, without the piece that explained it. He thought about Reyes's wife. Her name was Caroline. He'd found that out through a casualty support inquiry, a peripheral fact that had no operational relevance, and that he'd looked up anyway, because the red-haired woman in the photograph had been a complete person with a name, and he'd needed to know it. He didn't reach out. He didn't have anything to say that the casualty notification hadn't already said, and he wasn't sure that adding another voice to that particular grief was helpful rather than these opposite. He'd seen it go both ways. He left her alone. What he did instead was write not a report, not a debrief. A document he addressed to no one, marked for no filing system, which he completed over 2 nights, and which described, in the specific detail of someone who had been there, what Staff Sergeant Maya Vance had done in Kharan Valley. What she'd seen and how she'd seen it. The 3 days on the ridge. 24 minutes. The 12 minutes of stillness at the end, waiting for 2 hidden men to make the mistake that human biology made inevitable. He wrote it as clearly as he could, and when he was done, he read it once, and then secured it in the way he secured things that mattered. Then he sent a message to the program contact channel. Maya had given him the one that went through NIGHTGLASS's secure network, with a subject line that said, "For Vance." When cleared, he didn't know if she'd receive it. He didn't know if the channel was still active, or if she was in the field, or if the program's communication protocols would let something like that pass through. He sent it anyway because the alternative was not sending it, and not sending it felt like the specific cowardice of a man who'd witnessed something that mattered and had decided it was too complicated to acknowledge. 3 weeks later, a 1-line reply came through the channel. I read it, thank you. That was all. Cross read it twice. Then he put his phone face down on the desk and got back to work. 6 weeks after the tribunal verdict, a new training program was formally introduced across 4 special operations units in the regional command structure. It had no classified designation visible in the standard training catalog. It appeared under a general heading of Enhanced Night Operations Methodology, and it covered in careful, systematic detail the principles that had been operating in Kharan Valley. How to read thermal baseline patterns in specific terrain types, how to track electromagnetic emissions from field electronics, and identify device types by their signature profiles. How to build a behavioral model of enemy positions from sustained observation rather than active collection. How to move in mountain terrain at night using elevation and angle rather than concealment and stillness. The instructors who ran the first cycle of training were not famous. They didn't appear in any press. They were people who had done the work and understood it at the level of genuine experience rather than theoretical competence, and they taught it the way things that worked got taught directly, specifically, without decoration. 43 special operations personnel completed the first training cycle, then 91 more, then 216. The results showed in the field within 8 months, not dramatically, not in a single engagement that could be pointed to as the proof of concept. Gradually, in operations where enemy sniper effectiveness dropped off in ways that after-action analysis couldn't fully attribute to any single factor. In engagements where positions that should have been undetectable were detected. In firefights where the pattern of the engagement shifted earlier and more decisively than historical precedent would have predicted. The night, which had belonged to the hunters for a very long time, began to belong to someone else. Nobody published a paper on it. Nobody gave a speech. The people who knew what had changed knew why it had changed, and most of them were people who had learned the hard way in a valley, in the dark, with their backs against rock and no air support within range, and the specific sound of incoming fire getting closer, that the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one some single person who had decided to understand something completely instead of adequately. Maya Vance never heard herself described as extraordinary. Not because people didn't think it, but because the people who knew her well enough to think it were the same people who understood that she would object to the word on grounds that it missed the point. The point was not that she was extraordinary. The point was that she had done the work, the specific, grinding, patient, unspectacular work of learning something so thoroughly that it stopped being effort and became instinct, and that the work was available to anyone willing to do it. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. The night doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to whoever understands it. She said it at the beginning of a training session in a prefab building at a base whose location is not relevant, to a room of operators who had come in expecting something, a story, a lesson, a performance of expertise, and found instead a woman of 32, lean and unremarkable in her bearing, who looked at them with eyes that had seen 10 disappear into a mountain darkness, and proceeded to explain, without drama, exactly how she had found each one of them and what that meant for how they were going to do their jobs from this point forward. Some of them had heard stories. Most hadn't. By the end of the first session, it didn't matter whether they had or not. What she put in front of them was not a story. It was a method, a way of seeing that had been built from years of looking at things other people had stopped looking at because looking was slow and unspectacular and yielded nothing until suddenly it yielded everything. She was not trying to produce people who could do what she did. She was trying to produce people who could do what the work required, which was different and more important and more possible than most of them had believed when they walked in. She gave them that. Not all of them took it fully. Some took part of it. Some came back for a second session 6 months later and took more. A few of them took all of it and carried it into operations that went differently than they would have gone. And the men who came home from those operations sometimes knew specifically why and sometimes didn't, but they came home either way. And that was the thing. That was the whole of it, not the legend, not the exceptional, the ordinary accumulation of people doing their work better because someone had taken the time to show them how and had done so without requiring recognition for the showing. Cross heard she'd been promoted. He heard it secondhand through Okafor, who had his own networks of information that ran through different channels than Cross's did. Staff Sergeant to Sergeant First Class Administrative, quiet, The kind of promotion that appeared on a service record and went no further into the world. He didn't send a message. She wasn't the kind of person who needed one. What he did was look at the names on his team's roster for the next operation, 7 people, 3 of whom had completed the first training cycle, and feel the specific weight of the deal specific between that roster and the one that had walked into Kharan Valley. They were better prepared, not because of a single night, because of what that night had started. He picked up the roster. He briefed his team. He did his job. Outside the FOB walls, the mountains ran for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Cold and dark and indifferent, the same mountains that had been providing cover to armed men since before any living nation had existed. They didn't belong to anyone. Neither did the night, except to whoever understood it well enough to claim it. And somewhere out there, in a hide, on a ridge, in the specific patient's stillness of someone who had made peace with the darkness, because she had spent enough time in it to know every way it could be made, to speak that someone was still working, still watching, still waiting for the thing that didn't want to be found, to make the one mistake that biology and patience and complete attention would inevitably produce. The night was long. She had time. The most dangerous person in any darkness is not the one who makes the most noise. It's the one who has learned to listen until the darkness answers.